What remains of a world when its first witnesses are gone, and those who come later inherit only fragments? A few broken names, a few damaged symbols, a handful of stories pressed into clay before the river air, and the patience of centuries began to wear them thin. In the oldest remembered places between the Tigris and the Euphrates, there are traces of a presence that later generations did not seem to understand in quite the same way. The Anunnaki appear there, not as a modern fantasy, not yet as the elaborate machinery of contemporary speculation, but as beings woven into the earlier sacred language of order itself. They stand near the threshold where heaven touches kingship, where divine will becomes law, where human life is measured against a design it did not create. And yet, for all the solemn confidence of those first inscriptions, a peculiar unease survives inside them. The beginning is described with strange certainty. The ending is not. So before the body settles deeper into this quiet hour, before thought loosens its grip and drifts toward the edge of sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this work truly gives you something worth returning to. And wherever this voice finds you tonight, in whatever room, city, or hour of darkness, share your location and your local time below. There is something unsettling in the way ancient Mesopotamia remembers power. The earliest civilizations did not speak of history in the way later ages would. They did not draw a clean line between statecraft and ritual, between astronomy and prayer, between administration and the invisible architecture of heaven. Their world was continuous. A temple was not merely a building. A king was not merely a ruler. A city was not merely a cluster of walls and markets. Everything stood beneath a structure of correspondence, as though earthly life were an imitation of decisions being made elsewhere. In that older imagination, the Anunnaki belonged to the upper order. Their names moved through hymns, myths, and royal inscriptions with a weight that suggests they were not decorative figures. They were part of the grammar by which reality itself was explained. And still, something does not rest easily. Even in the surviving tablets, the Anunnaki are elusive. Sometimes they are divine judges of the underworld. Sometimes they are high-ranking powers associated with heaven and fate. Sometimes the term seems broad, almost collective, as if later scribes themselves were preserving a category whose original boundaries had already begun to blur. This is one of the first shadows in the record, and perhaps one of the most important. The modern mind often wants a fixed answer, one stable image, one official definition that locks the door and leaves no room for uncertainty. But the oldest material refuses to behave that way. It shifts, it flickers, it gives the impression not of invention, but of memory under pressure. That pressure may be the first real clue. In Sumerian tradition, memory was never safe. Clay could survive fire, but not always flood, war, neglect, or conquest. Libraries could be buried, but also shattered. Languages changed. Empires rewrote what they inherited. Priests copied from earlier copies. Meanings narrowed, expanded, fractured. To read Mesopotamia is to stand in a house rebuilt many times on its own ruins, each generation preserving a little, misunderstanding a little, smoothing over what no longer fit the order of the present. It is a civilization that reached astonishing heights of writing, law, irrigation, mathematics, and astronomical observation, yet so much of what it once knew survives only in pieces. And when the surviving pieces speak of divine beings once close to human affairs, then speak later in tones of distance, hierarchy, or abstraction, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the shift happened only in theology or in experience. The old stories are patient with ambiguity. They do not rush to explain themselves. In some compositions, the gods gather deliberate assigned destinies. In others, they seem dangerously near the mechanics of civilization itself, founding cities, establishing rights, granting kingship, regulating flood and famine. The Anunnaki belong to this atmosphere of immediate sacred authority. But what is striking is not simply that such beings were believed in. Nearly every ancient civilization imagined invisible agencies behind visible order. What is striking is the sense that something once active becomes ceremonial. Presence becomes memory. Memory becomes liturgy. Liturgy becomes tradition. And tradition, when repeated long enough, can preserve the outline of an event long after its meaning has gone dark. This is where the first fracture opens. If one reads only superficially, the matter seems simple enough. Human beings created gods in their own image, built temples, feared storms, sanctified kings, then slowly evolved their beliefs over centuries. This explanation is tidy, and perhaps in many respects it is true, but tidy explanations often arrive late. They are luxuries of distance. For the people living inside the earliest Mesopotamian worldview, the divine order was not a metaphor draped over politics. It was politics, law, agriculture, flood control, legitimacy, survival. To say that kingship descended from heaven was not poetic excess. It was a statement about origin, authority, and the terrifying fragility of human order in a landscape that could be fertile one season and merciless the next. And perhaps this is why the mystery deepens rather than fades. Because if the Anunnaki were only symbols, why did the traditions preserve such a strong sense of transmitted structure, as though they were inheriting not merely stories, but administrative memories from an earlier sacred age? Why does the language of descent, decree, and arrangement feel so procedural, so formal, so unlike the looser dreamlike terrain of later legend? Scholars, of course, have long treated these texts through philology, comparative religion, and mythic analysis, and rightly so. But even careful scholarship leaves open a quiet philosophical wound. Myths are not meaningless because they are myths. Sometimes myth is what history becomes when the event is too old, too damaged, too sacred, or too politically inconvenient to survive in plain form. Then there is the matter of absence. The ancient world often remembered catastrophes more vividly than origins. Floods, collapses, invasions, droughts, dynastic breaks. These left scars deep enough to echo for millennia. Mesopotamia remembers flood with a force that later traditions would inherit and transform. It remembers the instability of earthly order. It remembers that cities rise and disappear, that rivers wander, that language itself can be buried. Against that background, the fading closeness of divine powers begins to look less like a casual drift in religious imagination, and more like the cultural afterimage of separation. Not proof, never proof, only a pattern, dim but persistent. First intimacy, then distance. First instruction, then ritual repetition. First presence, then administration in absentia. One might say that every civilization carries, somewhere in its foundation, the memory of abandonment. Perhaps that is too severe a word. Perhaps departure is gentler, or exile, or withdrawal. Yet the emotional current remains. In the old Mesopotamian imagination, humanity is not entirely alone, but neither is it secure. It dwells beneath decisions made elsewhere, beneath a celestial order that can nourish or erase. Such a worldview would make sense in a land governed by rivers that give life and also take it away. But it would also make sense in the aftermath of some more ancient rupture, some event never recorded directly, only refracted through sacred language. If a catastrophe had broken the continuity between human communities and whatever they believed stood above them, would later generations not preserve the memory in precisely this damaged way? Through divine counsels, lost decrees, vanished ages, and a growing sadness beneath the rituals of remembrance. The trouble is that once such a possibility appears, even faintly, it changes the texture of everything that follows. The temples look different. The king lists feel stranger. The flood traditions darken. The silences between tablets begin to matter almost as much as the lines that survived. one starts to feel that ancient Mesopotamia is not merely telling stories about gods, but trying, with whatever language remained, to hold together the memory of a world after some immense discontinuity. And the Anunnaki, whether divine beings, sacred ancestors, celestial powers, or the names given to forces no longer understood, remain standing at the edge of that break. The oldest records do not say clearly why such beings seem to recede. They do not offer one final scene, one sealed account of departure, one unquestionable disaster that closes the matter forever. Instead, they leave behind the more troubling thing, a trail of presence without a proper farewell, as though the first keepers of memory knew that something had been lost, but lived too near the wound to name it cleanly, and in the stillness that follows such thoughts, another question begins to gather its shape. If the earlier civilizations remembered not simply gods, but the aftermath of separation, then what event was powerful enough to move divine beings out of history and leave humanity with only ritual, architecture, and grief? There is a moment, barely perceptible, when a presence begins to feel less like something encountered and more like something remembered. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with noise or rupture. It settles quietly into language, into ritual, into repetition. And in the earliest layers of Sumerian thought, that moment seems to already be underway, as though even the first scribes were writing from the far side of something that had already begun to fade. The temples of ancient Mesopotamia were not designed for absence. They were built as points of contact. Each city was aligned to a patron deity, each sanctuary constructed as a place where heaven could be approached through ordered space. The ziggurats, rising in stepped tiers toward the sky, were not monuments to distance, but to connection. Their geometry implied a bridge, a path upward, a deliberate attempt to reduce the separation between human and divine domains. And yet, what remains preserved in the texts is not the experience of meeting, but the insistence on maintaining the possibility of it. This distinction, subtle as it is, changes everything. In hymns dedicated to deities such as Anu, Enlil, and Enki, there is a tone of structured reverence that suggests not only devotion, but protocol. The language is precise, almost administrative. Powers are assigned, territories defined, responsibilities distributed across a cosmic hierarchy. The Anunnaki, in many contexts, appear not as singular figures, but as a council, beings whose authority is embedded in decision-making, judgment, and the ordering of existence itself. This is not the loose imagination of wandering myth. It carries the cadence of governance. But governance of what, exactly? The Sumerian worldview does not isolate the divine from the material. Floodwaters, crop cycles, astronomical patterns, political stability all fall within the same field of influence. To speak of the gods is to speak of systems, irrigation channels that must be maintained, seasonal rhythms that must be predicted, cities that must be protected. And so, when the Anunnaki are invoked, it is often in relation to structure. They are the unseen regulators of a world that requires constant calibration to remain habitable. Yet something begins to feel strained, because if these structures were once maintained through direct alignment with divine authority, then why do the rituals become so exacting, so repetitive, so concerned with precision? Why does the system seem to depend increasingly on human intermediaries, priests, scribes, temple officials, who must perform actions in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, as though any deviation might sever an already fragile connection? It is possible, of course, to interpret this as the natural development of organized religion. Complexity grows, institutions form, ritual becomes codified. But there is another possibility, quieter, less comfortable, that such precision arises not from increasing proximity, but from increasing distance, that the rituals are not expressions of contact, but attempts to preserve it, or to recreate it after it has begun to weaken. In some Sumerian texts, the divine assembly is described in ways that feel almost procedural. Decisions are made. Roles are assigned. Humanity itself is, in certain traditions, created or shaped to serve functions within this system, maintaining order, sustaining offerings, supporting the balance between forces that operate beyond direct human control. The Anunnaki, in this sense, are not merely objects of worship. They are part of an architecture within which humanity exists, and architectures can fail. There are hints, scattered and incomplete, that the relationship between gods and humans was not always stable. The Epic of Atrahasis, for instance, preserves a memory, fragmented, debated, but persistent, of tension within the divine order itself. The lower-ranking gods grow weary of labour. A decision is made. Humanity is created as a solution. Later, humanity becomes too numerous, too noisy. Another decision is made. A flood is sent. These narratives are often read symbolically, and rightly so, but beneath the symbolism lies a pattern, a system under strain, a balance that requires adjustment, intervention, correction. And what happens when the corrections fail? This question lingers beneath the surface of the texts, rarely addressed directly, yet impossible to ignore. Because the stories describe interventions, plagues, droughts, floods, but they do not describe a final, stable resolution. There is no clear moment when the system settles into permanence. Instead, there is a gradual shift in tone. The immediacy of divine involvement begins to recede. The gods remain, but their presence feels less immediate, more mediated, more distant. The temples continue. The rituals persist. The language of divine authority remains intact. But something intangible has changed. Perhaps it is most visible in the way kingship is described. Early traditions speak of kingship descending from heaven, as though authority itself were transferred directly from the divine realm into human hands. This is not framed as metaphor. It is presented as a structural fact of the world. Yet over time, the nature of kingship evolves. It becomes more human, more political, more entangled in the realities of power and conflict. The divine sanction remains, but it feels less immediate, more symbolic, as though the original transmission has become difficult to sustain. And still, no single text explains why. There is no definitive account of departure, no clear statement that the Anunnaki withdrew, or were forced away, or chose to leave. Instead, there is only the accumulation of small distances, a shift in emphasis, a change in tone, the gradual transformation of presence into memory. This is where the unease deepens, because gradual change can conceal abrupt events. A catastrophe, once absorbed into cultural memory, does not always remain sharp. It erodes. It becomes layered with interpretation, softened by retelling, reshaped by those who inherit it. What was once immediate becomes distant. What was once witnessed becomes myth. And what was once understood becomes ritual, repeated without full comprehension. If something had occurred, something large enough to disrupt the relationship between humanity and whatever the Anunnaki represented, would it not appear exactly like this in the record? Not as a single, clear narrative, but as a series of adjustments, reinterpretations, and quiet absences. The temples still stand in their broken forms, the ziggurats still rise from the plains, their steps worn by time and wind. The tablets remain, though many are fractured, incomplete, or lost, and within them the Anunnaki are still named, still invoked, still placed within the structure of the world. But the sense of immediacy has thinned. It is as though the architecture of connection survived longer than the connection itself. And somewhere within that architecture, within the rituals performed with unwavering precision, within the hymns recited across generations, within the careful preservation of names whose meanings may have already begun to drift, there is a question that does not quite form but refuses to disappear. If the earlier civilizations were built not only in the presence of the divine, but in response to it, then what does it mean that all the systems designed to maintain that presence continue, even as the presence itself becomes increasingly difficult to locate? And if the rituals are still being performed, who, if anyone, is still listening? Numbers are rarely innocent in the oldest records. They seem still at first, almost obedient, lined up in columns or impressed into clay with the same calm authority as names of kings and cities. But sometimes a number is less a measure than a warning. It marks the place where memory has crossed into distortion, or where distortion has become the only vessel strong enough to carry a memory too strange to preserve in ordinary form. And nowhere does that unease gather more heavily than in the Sumerian King List, where the first rulers do not reign for decades, or even generations, but for spans so immense that they seem to belong to another condition of existence altogether. The text itself is one of the most unsettling inheritances of Mesopotamia. It was copied and recopied over centuries, surviving in multiple versions, each with variations, yet preserving the same essential structure. Kingship descends from heaven. It is established in a city. A sequence of rulers follows. Then comes the flood. After the flood, kingship descends once more, and the story of rule begins again. The list is administrative in tone, almost dry in its presentation, as though it were merely recording a succession of authority. And perhaps that is precisely why it disturbs, because the impossible is delivered without drama. Before the flood, the reigns are colossal. Tens of thousands of years are assigned to individual kings. In some copies, Alulim of Eridu rules for 28,800 years. Alangar follows with 36,000. Others continue in similar magnitude until the antediluvian section takes on the shape of a chronology that no modern historical method can accept as literal. Then, after the flood, something changes. The reigns remain long at first, but they contract. Over time, they begin to resemble human spans more closely. The curve is unmistakable. Something has broken, and the text, whatever else it may be, preserves the impression of that break. The safest explanation is familiar. The numbers are symbolic. They may reflect numerological systems, ritual exaggeration, or dynastic prestige. Mesopotamian mathematics was deeply bound to the sexagesimal system, and later scribes were perfectly capable of shaping figures for ideological effect. One can imagine rulers lengthened into grandeur because antiquity itself carried authority. The farther back one goes, the larger the scale becomes. This is not absurd. Many civilizations enlarge the beginning. Origins are granted impossible size because they stand close to the sacred, and yet the pattern resists complete dismissal. The King List is not a wandering myth in poetic form. It has mythic features, certainly, but it also behaves like a political document. It organizes kingship by city. It creates legitimacy through continuity. It imposes order on competing dynasties. It was used, at least in part, to say who had ruled and why rule belonged where it did. In other words, it is not simply dreaming. It is governing through memory, which makes its impossible opening all the more difficult to explain away as ornament alone. Why begin a document of authority with a sequence so obviously removed from ordinary human experience? Unless the compilers believed those numbers were doing more than decorating the past. Some scholars have suggested that the immense reigns might encode something other than years as they are presently understood. Different systems of timekeeping, lunar calculations, schematic cycles, sacred mathematics. These possibilities have all been raised, though none solves the matter cleanly. Others see the antediluvian kings as mythic ancestors, not historical rulers at all, included because Mesopotamian thought did not separate mythic and historical time as sharply as later historians would. This too has force, but even here the same unease returns. Why is the flood the dividing line? Why does the text insist so strongly on a before and after? A line that sharp rarely appears by accident. The flood in Mesopotamian tradition is not merely weather, it is interruption. It divides the texture of reality itself. The world before the flood is ordered differently, measured differently, ruled differently. The world after the flood continues, but diminished, contracted, more recognizably human. The Sumerian King List does not pause to explain the full metaphysics of this transformation. It simply enacts it through numbers. It allows scale to collapse. It allows duration to shrink. It leaves the reader to feel, rather than fully decode, the sensation that history has passed through a narrowing gate. This is where the possibility of catastrophe begins to deepen into something more than a dramatic backdrop. If the Anunnaki traditions preserve memories of beings once near to the administration of earthly order, and if the King List preserves the memory of an earlier age whose rulers belong to impossible spans, then the contraction after the flood begins to look like more than literary convenience. It resembles the memory of a world that no longer operates under the same conditions, not proof, never proof, but a surviving shape, first expansion, then rupture, then reduction. One might object that human beings naturally romanticize beginnings, that every lost age becomes golden in retrospect. But the Sumerian record does not feel nostalgic in a simple way. It feels procedural, as though it is reluctantly carrying impossible data into a later age that no longer has the framework to interpret it. The scribes do not say, "Once life was magic." They say, in effect, "Here is who ruled, here is how long, then the flood came." The restraint is part of what gives the text its strange authority. It does not plead to be believed, it simply endures. And perhaps that is why so many later readers, from antiquarians to fringe theorists to careful historians, have felt drawn toward it. The King List does not invite certainty. It invites tension. Its enormous spans are too implausible for literal acceptance, too structured for easy dismissal, too politically embedded to be pure fantasy, and too sharply divided by catastrophe to feel random. It stands precisely at the point where damaged memory begins to resemble myth, because myth is the only language broad enough to contain what has been broken. There is another discomfort hidden in this pattern. If kingship truly descended from heaven, as the text insists, then the immense rains before the flood may not merely reflect extraordinary rulers, but extraordinary conditions of rule. Whether those conditions were theological, astronomical, environmental, or entirely symbolic remains uncertain. Yet the language of descent suggests transmission. Authority comes from elsewhere. It is installed. It governs through chosen hands. And after the flood, although kingship descends again, it no longer bears the same scale. Something has returned but altered, or perhaps only a remnant has. This possibility, however speculative, changes the emotional weight of the list. It stops being merely a curiosity of ancient chronology and becomes a record of decline. Not decline in the moralizing sense, but decline in continuity, a severing, a reduction of span, of order, of closeness to the source. If the first kings belonged to an age when the divine and human stood nearer together, then the flood did not simply destroy bodies and cities. It may have destroyed the terms under which that nearness was possible, and if so, then the Anunnaki do not disappear all at once. They begin to retreat into the structure of texts like this one, still present, still implied, still standing behind kingship itself, but no longer encountered in the same world their first names seem to remember. What survives is administration after wonder, record after contact, continuity after fracture. The list ends, in later sections, among dynasties more familiar to historians, closer to the scale of politics, war, succession, and ordinary ambition. Yet the beginning remains there, like an exposed root beneath a polished floor. It cannot be removed without collapsing the structure above it. The impossible rains remain because the memory of the earliest age remained necessary, even when its meaning had gone dim. And so the question becomes hard to ignore. If the flood marks not only destruction, but the compression of time, authority, and human possibility, then what exactly was lost in that narrowing? A symbolic age? A different calendar? A sacred exaggeration? Or the last damaged memory of a world in which the beings later called Anunnaki had not yet fully withdrawn, and history itself had not yet learned how to live with their absence? Water remembers what stone tries to forget. It leaves lines on temple foundations, salts in abandoned soil, and thin veils of silt over the lives that once trusted riverbanks too completely. In the oldest lands of Mesopotamia, flood was never a distant idea. It was a season, a threat, a law of the landscape. And yet the flood that survives in the deepest layers of memory does not feel like ordinary inundation. It arrives with a different weight. It separates eras. It interrupts the continuity of rule. It turns genealogy into aftermath. By the time later civilizations inherit the story, the water has become almost total, and what remains afloat is not merely a family or a boat, but the unbearable suggestion that history itself once had to begin again. The Mesopotamian flood traditions do not come from one single source, neatly preserved and easily explained. They live across texts, across centuries, across changes in language and empire. In the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra, in the Akkadian Atrahasis, in the flood tablet embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh, the pattern persists even as details shift. The gods decide. A warning is given to one human, a vessel is built, the waters rise, human life is nearly erased, then somehow continuity resumes. Scholars have traced these parallels for generations, comparing motifs, reconstructing damaged lines, and noting how the Hebrew account of Noah later echoes the older Mesopotamian forms. But what remains most unsettling is not that the stories resemble one another. It is that they all preserve the same emotional architecture, the sense that the world once crossed through a violence so absolute that memory afterward could only speak in symbols. In Atrahasis, the reasons given for the flood are almost painfully strange to modern ears. Humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, too burdensome. The divine order, once sustained by balance, begins to fray. Enlil is disturbed by human clamour. Droughts and plagues fail to solve the problem. The flood becomes the final answer. Read literally, this sounds like theological drama. Read symbolically, it opens other possibilities. Noise may be a moral metaphor, but it may also reflect the ancient intuition that human systems had exceeded their bounds, that some form of pressure, ecological, social, spiritual, had become unbearable. What is striking is not the moral lesson later interpreters would draw from it, but the image of a world no longer functioning within tolerable limits. That image has a long shadow. For more than a century, archaeologists working in Mesopotamian sites uncovered traces of localized flood deposits, layers of sediment in places like Shuruppak, Kish, and Ur. These findings were once greeted with enormous excitement, as though at last the biblical flood had found its geological signature. Later study made the picture more cautious. The layers were real, but they did not all belong to the same moment, nor did they prove a single global event. Mesopotamia flooded often. Rivers changed course. Settlements were buried and rebuilt. The earth itself encouraged repetition. And yet this caution does not dissolve the mystery. In some ways, it deepens it. Because if the flood story was not born from one universal catastrophe, then perhaps it emerged from many disasters compressed by cultural memory into one overwhelming wound. Not one flood, but flood as civilizational trauma. And trauma rarely preserves chronology cleanly. This is why the flood in ancient memory feels so different from the flood in hydrology. Geology can describe sediment, drainage, erosion, basin overflow. It can date layers and track climate patterns, But human memory does something else. It gathers separate shocks into one symbolic centre. It strips away the small distinctions between years and generations and preserves only what mattered most: the world before, the water, the survivors, the changed world after. Such compression does not make the story false, it makes it human. The Black Sea flood hypothesis once stirred similar fascination, proposing that rising waters from the Mediterranean catastrophically inundated a lower freshwater basin around the 7th millennium BCE. The theory remains debated, revised, resisted. It may not explain Mesopotamian traditions directly, and caution is necessary. But its appeal reveals something important. Again and again, modern inquiry returns to the same possibility: that flood myths may encode memories of real environmental upheavals, shoreline losses, river disasters, and abrupt transitions that left impressions deeper than any ordinary historical record. Ancient people may not have possessed modern vocabulary, but they possess terror, and terror has a way of surviving in narrative long after measurements are gone. In the Mesopotamian versions, the gods are never fully absent from the catastrophe. They send it, regret it, fear it, or respond to it. In Gilgamesh, when the storm comes, even the gods recoil from what has been unleashed. They cower like dogs in some translations, huddled at the edges of heaven while the world below is dissolved. It is a remarkable image. The divine is not serenely sovereign over destruction. It is implicated, divided, perhaps even overwhelmed by its own decision. This detail matters. It suggests that the flood was not remembered as a smooth act of controlled judgment, but as a rupture so great that even the beings associated with cosmic order seem unsettled by it. And that opens the darker possibility. What if the flood tradition was not only about punishment, or purification, or the reset of an unruly humanity? What if it also preserved the memory of a breakdown within the order attributed to the Anunnaki and the higher gods themselves? Not their extinction, not their defeat in any literal modern sense, but their failure to maintain the previous arrangement between heaven and earth. In that light, the flood becomes more than catastrophe. It becomes the mechanism of separation. After it, kingship returns, but diminished. Ritual continues, but contact weakens. The gods remain in memory, but not with the same immediacy. The Anunnaki are still named, yet the world they governed seems farther away. It is tempting to force this into certainty, but certainty would only flatten the very strangeness that makes the old texts worth listening to. The more careful path is to stay with the pattern. Before the flood, the records preserve impossible reigns and a closer sacred order. The flood stands in the middle as interruption. After the flood, human life continues, but within narrowed conditions. This does not prove that divine beings physically departed in the way later speculative traditions sometimes imagine, but it does preserve a cultural intuition that something enormous was lost, and that the loss was bound to water, judgment, and a resetting of the human place within the world. There is also the quiet cruelty of survival in these stories. One man is warned, one vessel is built, knowledge is not saved equally. Most of humanity disappears into the water, and with it, whatever local memories, skills, lineages, and observations had once existed. A catastrophe on that scale would not only kill bodies, it would shatter continuity. It would leave later generations with rituals detached from origins, cities rebuilt over older ruins, and a desperation to explain why the world felt both inherited and damaged. That may be one reason the flood traditions persisted so powerfully. They explained not only ruin, but ignorance. They gave form to the haunting suspicion that humanity had come after something greater and could no longer fully recall it. And if that suspicion survived into temple culture, kingship ideology, and sacred literature, then perhaps the Anunnaki were remembered less as eternal abstractions than as beings associated with the age before the Great Severing, an age whose final threshold was crossed in water, not because the texts say this outright, but because they circle it from too many directions to ignore: presence before, catastrophe between, distance after. By the time later religions inherit the flood, much has already been transformed. The story becomes more moral, more singular, more tightly governed by one divine will. Yet beneath those later shapes, the older Mesopotamian current still moves. It carries not just judgment, but the ache of interruption. It remembers a world that did not merely suffer disaster, but lost its former terms of relationship with the powers above it. And so the water does not settle when the boat comes to rest. It remains in the background of everything that follows, in the shortened rains, in the increasingly mediated rituals, in the strange effort to preserve names whose full meaning seem to recede with every century. The flood ends, but the after-flood world is already a quieter place, as though some great conversation had been broken off mid-sentence and never truly resumed. If that is so, then the catastrophe that took the Anunnaki from the centre of human memory may not have begun with fire or rebellion or war at all. It may have begun with water rising over the first foundations, carrying away not only cities, but the last unbroken bridge between the human world and whatever had once stood so near above it. Long before the sky became an object of science, it was already an archive of dread. It moved above the first cities with a precision that inspired reverence, but also with just enough instability to keep reverence from ever becoming comfort. The stars returned in their seasons. The moon thickened and thinned with patient regularity. The sun marked harvest and heat. Yet across that larger order came interruptions, eclipses, comets, meteors, blood-coloured horizons, storms that arrived with unnatural violence, and planetary motions whose meaning seemed too deliberate to be ignored. To the modern eye, these are phenomena. To the ancient Mesopotamian mind, they were messages, fractures, warnings pressed into the visible face of heaven. And if the Anunnaki belonged in part to the architecture of the upper world, then the moment the sky itself became dangerous may have been the moment their withdrawal began to feel not symbolic, but necessary. Mesopotamia watched the heavens with a seriousness that is difficult to exaggerate. The same civilization that built canals and codified laws also tracked Venus, recorded eclipses and assembled omen series of astonishing detail. By the first millennium BCE, works such as Enuma Anu Enlil preserved hundreds upon hundreds of celestial observations linked to earthly consequences. A halo around the moon, an eclipse at the wrong hour, the unusual appearance of a planet. None of these were treated as curiosities. They were read as disturbances in the covenant between heaven and earth. The sky was not distant scenery. It was part of government, part of fate, part of the living grammar by which reality communicated its instability. This instinct may appear superstitious from a later distance, yet it carries a deeper logic than modern dismissal often allows. When survival depends on seasonal regularity, when kingship claims descent from heaven, when temple life is ordered according to celestial timing, then the sky is not merely above society, it is woven into its confidence. A disruption in the sky is therefore not just visual, it is constitutional. It suggests that the invisible order underwriting the world may itself be under strain. Such strain appears everywhere in ancient omen literature. The texts are meticulous, almost obsessive, as though repetition itself might defend against surprise. If an eclipse occurs in such and such a month, the king is in danger. If Venus disappears too long, there will be famine. The point is not that every omen was accurate in any scientific sense. The point is that a civilization this attentive had learned, somewhere in its long memory, to fear irregularity above all things. One does not build systems of omen interpretation on that scale without inheriting a profound anxiety that the heavens can, at times, cease to behave, and perhaps they did. Comets, though poorly understood in antiquity, have a peculiar power over the human imagination because they violate expectation. They appear without permission, brighten, grow tails, drift across the fixed order, and then vanish. Ancient cultures across the world treated them as omens of kings' deaths, wars, plagues, or dynastic transformation. Mesopotamia was no exception. The exact interpretation changed over time, and surviving texts are often fragmentary, but the emotional pattern remains. A sudden object in the sky was not innocent. It was a sign that the upper world had moved out of sequence. There is no need to force this into a literal narrative of divine flight. The deeper question is subtler. What happens to a civilization whose sacred order depends on heavenly stability if the heavens begin to produce memorable episodes of terror? A severe eclipse at the wrong political moment could destabilize a king. A meteor storm could be read as attack. Prolonged atmospheric anomalies, red sunsets, dimmed light, strange seasonal failures could pass into collective memory as evidence that heaven itself had become hostile or inaccessible. Even without modern catastrophe theories, the emotional truth is easy to feel. When the sky, source of rhythm, becomes source of dread, the relationship between human beings and their gods changes. Some modern researchers, standing far outside the texture of Mesopotamian religion, have speculated about ancient memories of cosmic catastrophe, comet encounters, impact events, solar disturbance, even recurring celestial trauma embedded in myth. Much of this remains controversial, and rightly so. Evidence is uneven, chronologies are disputed, imagination rushes in where data thins. But even responsible scholarship acknowledges that ancient people sometimes encoded real environmental or astronomical events into sacred language. Myths of falling fire, darkened suns, wandering stars, or heavenly battles are not automatically records of literal disasters, but neither are they automatically empty inventions. They are often what memory sounds like when terror has outlived explanation. In that light, some Mesopotamian motifs begin to tremble with fresh unease. Divine councils become less serene. Storm gods grow more violent. Cosmic order requires increasing management. Omen texts proliferate. Ritual substitution ceremonies are performed to shield kings from eclipse danger, with temporary substitute kings sometimes installed to absorb the predicted doom. This is a remarkable practice. It suggests not only belief in celestial causality, but a state-level fear so deep that political ritual had to absorb the shock of the sky. The heavens were not decorative theology. They were an active threat environment. And where in such a world do the Anunnaki stand? If they once represented powers woven into the regulation of fate, then a dangerous sky would not merely inspire more worship. It might force a reimagining of divine presence itself. Beings once understood as close administrators of order might now seem remote, wrathful, divided or withdrawn behind layers of omen and priestly mediation. The more unstable the sky appeared, the more necessary interpretation became, and the more interpretation grew, the farther direct presence receded. Humanity no longer stood beneath a reliable canopy of sacred structure. It stood beneath signals, warnings, interruptions. Under such conditions, the gods do not vanish. They become difficult. This may help explain a subtle movement in the old record. Early sacred imagination often carries the flavour of architecture, assignment, arrangement, descent, installation. Later religious practice, while still rooted in these structures, carries more anxiety. One must read the signs correctly. One must appease, avert, substitute, delay. Ritual becomes less a celebration of cosmic harmony and more a negotiation with cosmic risk. If this shift reflects historical experience rather than mere theological evolution, then somewhere in the background there may have been centuries of remembered celestial unease. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to underestimate what repeated sky terror would do to the human mind. A people can rebuild after flood. They can migrate after drought. But if the sky itself becomes unpredictable, then the highest symbolic guarantee of order is compromised. Night after night, the same vault that once instructed planting, prayer, and kingship now becomes a screen onto which dread is projected. The sacred no longer reassures, It warns, and once heaven becomes warning, abandonment is never far behind. Not because the gods have necessarily gone anywhere in a literal sense, but because the emotional experience of nearness has been replaced by the exhausting labour of interpretation. There is another possibility, more haunting for being impossible to prove. If some real celestial event or sequence of events profoundly marked ancient memory, then later traditions may have transformed the trauma into stories of divine conflict, divine anger, or divine withdrawal. Not because people were foolish, but because myth is the only language large enough to hold what overwhelms ordinary explanation. The sky grows strange, the rulers panic, ritual intensifies, the old assurances weaken. In time, what remains is a civilization still looking upward, but no longer with the same confidence that someone benevolent is looking back. And so the heavens, once a ladder, begin to resemble a sealed ceiling. The tablets do not state this plainly. They continue to record names, rituals, eclipses, omens, yet behind the technical devotion there is a shadow of fear. It is the fear of misreading, of being late, of not knowing whether the sign in the sky announces warning, judgment, or the final proof that the old order is already slipping beyond reach. If the flood shattered continuity on Earth, then perhaps the dangerous sky finished the work above it, teaching humanity that whatever had once governed from heaven could no longer be relied upon in the old way. That possibility leaves a strange aftertaste in the history of the ancient world. Because once the sky becomes a place of rupture, every temple built beneath it changes meaning. Every ziggurat reaches upward into uncertainty. Every king who claims divine mandate rules under a vault that may at any time contradict him. And if the Anunnaki did not simply leave, but withdrew as the heavens themselves grew unstable, then the next question becomes unavoidable. When the sky could no longer be trusted, what happened to the earth that had once depended on it so completely? When the ground begins to fail, it rarely does so with ceremony. There is no single sound that announces the exhaustion of a river, no dramatic line drawn across the horizon to warn a civilization that the terms of its survival are quietly being revised. Instead, there is delay, hesitation, an almost imperceptible thinning of certainty. A canal silts faster than expected. A field whitens with salt. The spring flood arrives too weakly or too violently, or not at the time memory has prepared for. Then 1 year of strain becomes several, and what was once described as divine order starts to feel more like negotiation with a world no longer willing to obey. Mesopotamia always lived on that edge. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine the region only as the lush cradle of civilization, an irrigated plain where writing, law, and kingship rose almost naturally from fertile ground. But fertility there was never simple. It had to be engineered, watched, redistributed, and defended against the very rivers that made it possible. The Tigris and Euphrates were generous only within limits. Too much water, and settlements drowned. Too little, and fields cracked open beneath the sun. Irrigation expanded wealth, but also carried long-term risks. Salinization, channel instability, dependence on labour coordination so exact that political weakness could become ecological collapse. This is why ancient Mesopotamian religion cannot be separated from land management. To modern thought, such a connection may seem symbolic, but in that world it was material. The gods were not merely prayed to for good harvests, they were woven into the logic by which harvests were thought possible at all. Enlil was not just wind, but authority over atmosphere and command. Enki was not simply fresh water, but cunning, order, and the hidden intelligence beneath survival. If the Anunnaki stood somewhere within the larger architecture of these powers, then their nearness would have been felt not only in temples or myths, but in the reliability of the world itself. A functioning environment was not merely nature, it was permission, and permission can be withdrawn. Modern paleoclimate research has revealed what ancient memory only felt in broken episodes. The ancient Near East did not move through time under stable conditions. There were abrupt aridification events, prolonged drought phases, regional cooling episodes, and periods of ecological stress capable of undermining entire societies. The so-called 2-kilo-year event, for example, has drawn enormous interest because of its possible connection to widespread disruption across Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, and beyond, around the late 3rd millennium BCE. Debate continues over its exact severity and local variation, as it should. Yet the broader truth remains. Ancient civilizations were far more vulnerable to climatic shifts than their monumental ruins suggest. That vulnerability leaves a particular kind of trace in the imagination. It is not simply fear of nature, it is betrayal. A river that built cities can also become the agent of their humiliation. Soil can turn against the hands that mastered it. The same irrigation systems that announce human control can gradually poison the land through salt accumulation, reducing yields and forcing adaptation or retreat. Archaeological and textual evidence from southern Mesopotamia has long suggested that environmental stress, including salinity and shifting agricultural patterns, played a role in the transformation of Sumerian urban life. Crops changed, certain cities lost prominence, northern regions sometimes gained relative advantage. None of this needs mysticism to be real. And yet once these changes are placed inside the sacred grammar of Mesopotamia, they take on another dimension. Environmental decline does not feel secular. It feels like the fading of sanction. If one had inherited stories of divine order, of kingship descending from heaven, of sacred beings establishing the world in measured form, then the slow failure of the earth would not look random. It would look like withdrawal. Not necessarily because anyone saw celestial figures physically departing over the horizon, but because reality itself was no longer confirming the old relationship. Crops fail, canals clog, rains shift, and suddenly the rituals that once seemed to maintain cosmic balance begin to feel increasingly desperate. The system remains in place, but the results weaken. Prayers continue, offerings continue, administrative precision continues. Yet the land answers with uncertainty. This is where catastrophe becomes difficult to define. Modern language often seeks the event, the eruption, the impact, the invasion, the sudden collapse. But many ancient worlds did not end that way. They eroded. They staggered. They entered periods of cumulative stress so prolonged that no one generation could clearly distinguish ordinary hardship from the beginning of civilizational fracture. A city might still be standing while its ecological foundation had already been compromised beyond recovery. A temple might still receive offerings while the river that sustained its fields had already shifted into a different future. Such slow violence is harder to remember than flood. It lacks a single image, and perhaps that is why traditions of divine withdrawal become so important. They give emotional shape to what geology and climatology later describe in systems and timelines, where science sees precipitation decline, salinity increase, and resource strain. Ancient consciousness may have felt abandonment by the powers once thought to regulate the world. This does not make the experience irrational. It makes it existentially accurate. For a civilization whose order depended on harmony between heaven, kingship, labour, and land, ecological instability would indeed feel like a broken covenant. There are moments in the historical record when this sensation seems almost visible. The decline of Akkadian power, the stress visible in settlements across northern Mesopotamia, the later contractions and regional shifts, none reduced to a single cause, and scholars remain right to resist neat collapse stories. Human systems are complicated. Politics, war, migration, trade, disease, and environment intertwine. Yet within that complexity lies a pattern too persistent to ignore. When the land falters, symbolic order falters with it. Confidence in divine mandate must adapt or fracture. The old certainty that the world is being maintained from above begins to thin. And if that thinning had been happening in waves across generations, then the memory of the Anunnaki would inevitably change. Beings once associated with order, decree, and structure would no longer be experienced through stability but through absence. Their names would remain, their temples would remain, their place in myth would remain. But the daily evidence of their governance, the obedient flood, the fertile soil, the predictable sky, the functioning city, would become harder to trust. There is something almost cruel in this transformation. Human beings are capable of surviving disaster when the rules remain intelligible. But when the rules themselves begin to unravel, survival becomes more than material. It becomes interpretive. People must decide what the failure means. Has a king sinned? Have rights been neglected? Has a god become angry? Has the age itself changed? Or has the world passed beyond the range in which the old sacred agreements can still hold? That final possibility introduces a colder kind of fear. Not punishment, but incompatibility. Not divine rage, but the ending of conditions. If the Anunnaki belonged to a world calibrated differently, a world of greater ecological balance, stronger cosmic alignment, or simply another civilizational state, then environmental collapse may not have driven them away as one drives away intruders. It may have rendered their order unsustainable on Earth. The land itself may have ceased to support the pattern through which their presence had once been intelligible. Then the temples would remain as shells of a conversation the environment could no longer sustain. This thought gives the ruins of Mesopotamia a particular sadness. Brick dissolves. Canals vanish into dust. The outlines of cities survive from above like the memory of veins in a body that no longer breathes. And beneath that silence lies a deeper question than whether ancient people misunderstood climate. Of course, they lacked modern terminology, but perhaps they understood the experience more intimately than modern language sometimes allows. They knew what it meant to live inside a world whose generosity had become conditional. They knew what it meant to maintain rituals while the land beneath them grew less responsive. They knew, in their own sacred terms, the terror of watching order decay without knowing whether it was temporary, deserved, or final. If the flood marked the violent severing, then the failing earth may have been the long confirmation that the severing would not be healed quickly. Water can destroy in a moment. Soil can teach loss more slowly. It turns the catastrophe into duration. It stretches absence across generations until no one remembers what presence actually felt like. And once that happens, once the land no longer obeys the old covenant, another transformation becomes inevitable. The temples cease to be places where divine order is encountered naturally and become something else. Machines of preservation, architectures built not only to honour the sacred, but to hold its memory in place against a world that is steadily forgetting how to receive it. A structure can outlive the reason it was built. Long after the hands that placed its first brick have turned to dust, long after the language spoken in its courts has become the work of scholars and fragments, a building may continue to stand in the mind as if it still remembers its original task. This is the strange gravity of the Mesopotamian temple. It was never merely shelter, never merely ornament, never merely a place where belief was performed for comfort. It was designed with the seriousness of a device. Its stairs, chambers, offerings, alignments, acoustics, and repeated rites suggest something more demanding than devotion alone. By the time the written record becomes thick enough to study in detail, the temple already seems to be doing two things at once: preserving a relationship with the divine and compensating for the possibility that the relationship is no longer effortless. This distinction is easy to miss because ritual often looks timeless from the outside. A priest enters, words are spoken, smoke rises, a sequence is observed, and later observers assume continuity. But continuity is one of the oldest illusions in history. People preserve forms most carefully when the original conditions that gave rise to those forms have started to weaken. A civilization repeats what it fears losing. It codifies what no longer comes naturally. In that sense, the Mesopotamian temple may be read not only as a house of the gods, but as an archive of emergency measures, an architecture of exactness built to hold open a channel that the world itself was no longer holding open on its own. The temple economy of Sumer and later Mesopotamia was vast. Sanctuaries owned land, managed labour, received offerings, distributed goods, and coordinated ritual calendars with extraordinary discipline. This has often been treated, correctly, as evidence that religion and administration were inseparable. But the administrative nature of the temple carries another undertone. If the gods once stood close enough to human order that kingship itself could be said to descend from heaven, then why must access to the sacred become so procedural, so mediated, so dependent on specialist knowledge? Why must every timing, formula, and object be controlled with such care? One answer is simple. Complexity breeds institution. Large civilizations need organized priesthoods. Yet another answer continues to whisper beneath the first. Procedure becomes sacred when spontaneity can no longer be trusted. Precision becomes holy when contact has become unstable. This possibility changes the emotional meaning of the ziggurat. Rising in stages above the city plain, it has often been described as a symbolic mountain, a meeting point between earthly settlement and the elevated sphere of divine power. That is true, but perhaps incomplete. A symbolic mountain does not require such persistent maintenance, such ritual traffic, such embedded concern with celestial observation and ordered ascent. The ziggurat seems to assume distance and answer it with construction. It materializes the hope that height, sequence, and correctly arranged space can restore proportion between the human and the divine. In that sense, it feels almost technological, not in any crude modern fantasy of machines hidden under stone, but in a more ancient sense, a structured means by which an effect is sought through repeatable design. Temples also carried sound in significant ways. The ancient Near East understood the force of spoken formula, incantation, lamentation, hymn, and sacred recitation. Sound was not decoration. It organized presence. It marked transitions between ordinary and consecrated states. In enclosed or carefully proportioned spaces, voice becomes more than language. It becomes vibration, atmosphere, an ordering pressure acting upon both listener and room. Modern researchers who study ancient ritual acoustics in various civilizations have shown how architecture can intensify concentration, memory, and a sense of altered presence. Mesopotamia left no single manual declaring that temple sound was a technical system in the modern sense, but the seriousness with which speech, chant, and formula were preserved suggests that words were expected to do more than inform. They were expected to activate. And activation is an interesting word here, because once the sacred begins to feel less like encounter and more like maintenance, ritual changes character. It ceases to be only praise and becomes also recalibration. The daily offerings to divine statues, the washing, clothing, feeding, and processional movement of those cult images have often been discussed as signs that the gods were treated as living presences. They were indeed. Yet there is another tone hidden within the practice. If the divine presence needs to be invited, refreshed, sustained, housed, nourished, and ritually reawakened, then the temple is doing ongoing repair work at the boundary between worlds. The image is not merely representing the god, it is participating in the labour of keeping the god's accessibility from fading entirely. This may help explain why loss and restoration rituals became so important. When statues were stolen in war, damaged, or removed, the crisis was not aesthetic. It was cosmic and political at once. A city without its divine image had suffered more than insult. It had lost a node of contact, an axis through which order was believed to enter the civic body. Such events could destabilize kingship, identity, and confidence in the entire arrangement between heaven and earth. That intensity suggests that the temple system was not preserving abstract theology, it was preserving dependence. At some point, however, dependence begins to feel like memory management. The rites continue, but one begins to wonder whether the temple is trying to maintain a divine nearness that no longer arrives with its old force. This does not mean priests were frauds, or that the ancient world was secretly disenchanted. It means only that institutions often become more elaborate precisely when the thing they mediate is becoming harder to access directly. The more fragile the connection, the more careful the choreography. Seen this way, temple ritual after flood, climate strain and celestial dread takes on a new sadness. It becomes the work of holding a broken pattern in place. Every recitation, every offering table, every ascent up the stepped height may contain an unspoken anxiety. What if the order no longer answers because the age that sustained it has already passed? Then the temple is no longer only a dwelling for the divine. It is a memory machine, built to keep heaven legible in an earth that is gradually forgetting the grammar. There is no need to exaggerate this into a claim that Mesopotamian temples were secret scientific devices in the modern sensational sense. The older reality is more haunting than that. Human beings, faced with the fading of an inherited sacred world, built systems strong enough to remember what they feared losing. They made architecture do the work of fidelity. They gave brick, height, sound, and repetition the burden of preserving a relationship whose original terms may already have been slipping beyond living experience. And this may be why the temple endures so powerfully in the imagination. A ruin is moving not only because it has fallen, but because it reveals what someone once believed could be sustained against falling. The ziggurat says, ascent is still possible. The sanctuary says, order can still be invited. The liturgy says, if the sequence is kept, the bond may hold. Yet the very existence of such carefully repeated assurances suggests a world no longer certain that the bond holds by itself. So the temples remained busy while the sky grew harder to read and the land less willing to yield. Priests timed festivals to celestial cycles, maintained divine statues, guarded sacred formulas, and kept the administrative pulse of the holy city alive. From the outside, this looks like confidence. From within, it may also have been vigilance. One can imagine generations serving faithfully, not because the gods were obviously absent, but because the cost of letting the forms lapse had become unthinkable. When direct certainty weakens, preservation itself becomes sacred duty. And somewhere within that duty, another transformation was already taking shape. The people tending the rites may have begun to inherit words older than their own understanding, formulas whose original force was preserved more carefully than their original meaning. The temple could keep the pattern alive, but only up to a point. Beyond that point, the burden would fall to another class of guardians, those who copied, interpreted, and transmitted the sacred language itself, even as its deepest referent began to recede into silence. If the temples were machines of remembrance, then the priests and scribes who served within them stood at the edge of a more difficult task still, preserving not only presence, but the fading grammar of a vanished conversation. There is a particular loneliness in preserving words whose first life has already begun to fade. A scribe can copy signs with perfect care, a priest can recite formulas without error, a school can transmit a language long after it has ceased to be spoken in the marketplace, and still something essential may be slipping away. Not the text itself, but the horizon of experience that once made the text immediate. This may be one of the quiet tragedies hidden inside Mesopotamian civilization. It did not simply inherit sacred knowledge, it inherited the burden of carrying forward fragments from ages already half obscured, and with each generation the act of preservation became more impressive and more haunted. The scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia was one of the great achievements of the human mind. Clay tablets, lexical lists, hymns, omen collections, king lists, myths, legal records, astronomical observations, administrative accounts, all were impressed into matter with a discipline that still astonishes. The Aduba, the scribble school, did not merely teach writing. It shaped memory into institution. To become a scribe was to enter a lineage of controlled transmission, a world in which language itself became architecture. Signs had to be learned, copied, ordered, interpreted. Older texts were preserved not because they were convenient, but because they were authoritative, even when they had already become difficult. And difficulty is where the atmosphere changes. By the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, Sumerian continued to be copied long after it had ceased to function as a normal spoken language. It endured in liturgy, scholarship, prestige writing, and learned tradition. That alone is telling. Civilizations do not hold on to dead or semi-dead languages so stubbornly unless those languages carry access to something the present does not trust itself to reinvent. Sumerian had become more than speech. It had become a vessel of sanctioned antiquity, a channel through which contact with the oldest order of knowledge could still be attempted, but the more ancient the text, the more fragile the understanding. Glossaries were needed, bilingual lists were needed, commentarial traditions grew. In other words, the guardians of knowledge were already living in translation. This is not a minor detail. It means that even within Mesopotamia itself, the oldest sacred material was becoming, over time, partially foreign to those preserving it. One generation copied from another. A meaning was stabilized through training, comparison, and institutional memory. But any such system also introduces distance. A formula may survive exactly while its original resonance changes. A divine name may still be invoked, while the world that first experienced that name as a living power has already receded. In this way, preservation can become both triumph and elegy. The priests stood inside that tension. They were not merely functionaries of ritual, they were custodians of relevance. Their role was to keep the sacred intelligible enough to remain active. They had to know calendars, offerings, purification procedures, omens, hymns, incantations, and the proper handling of divine images. Yet one can sense, beneath the authority of such knowledge, an undertow of anxiety. The more one must train specialists to maintain contact, the more that contact appears to depend on expertise rather than immediacy. The sacred becomes increasingly mediated. The priest becomes interpreter not only of gods but of inherited forms whose deepest context may already be thinning. This is especially striking in the vast omen literature of Mesopotamia. Collections such as Enuma Anu Enlil, Shuma Alu, and many other divinatory series reveal an astonishing desire to classify signs. If this happens, then that will follow. If a liver has this mark, if a planet appears in that way, if a dream contains such a feature, a consequence is expected. Modern readers often see only superstition, but classification at this scale suggests something else. A civilization trying to preserve a grammar of correspondence. The world is assumed to speak, but no longer plainly. Therefore signs must be catalogued. Patterns must be remembered. Interpretation must become systematic because spontaneous clarity cannot be trusted. This is what it means to live at the edge of a vanished language. The phrase need not refer only to speech. A civilization can lose a language of relation. It can continue naming the gods while losing confidence in how the gods once made themselves known. It can preserve ritual forms while sensing, however dimly, that those forms are addressing an order less immediately accessible than before. In that condition, the priesthood becomes a bridge over a widening gap. Necessary, prestigious, disciplined, and quietly tragic. Because bridges are most needed where something has already been broken. There are hints of this emotional reality in the way later Mesopotamian scholarship looked backward. Antiquity itself carried sanctity. Old texts were copied not merely for curiosity, but because age conferred authority. This reverence for the ancient can be read as conservatism, yet it may also indicate a deep civilizational instinct, the belief that truth lay nearer the beginning, and that later generations survived by careful custody rather than fresh revelation. If so, then the scribes were not simply preserving literature. They were guarding the remains of an older conversation. And conversations change when one side grows silent. not completely silent perhaps. The priests still reported omens, the gods still entered political life through rituals, dreams, and divine consultation, the temples still functioned. But silence is rawly absolute in historical consciousness. More often it arrives as attenuation. Messages become harder to decode, ritual outcomes become less certain, symbols multiply where encounters grow rare. The very proliferation of interpretive systems may signal not a rich abundance of immediate divine speech, but the opposite. The need to search harder because the old clarity is weakened. From this angle, the Anunnaki begin to appear differently again. They are not lost because their names vanished. Their names survived. They are lost because the world that could receive those names without mediation may have been disappearing for centuries. Priests and scribes inherited the duty of retaining them, but retention is not the same as contact. One can know the title of an office long after the office has been emptied. One can maintain the protocol of an audience long after the sovereign has ceased to appear in person. Perhaps this is why the later tradition so often feels structurally intact and emotionally altered. The divine hierarchy remains, ritual law remains, sacred language remains. Yet the texture is different from the earliest atmosphere of dissent, installation, and close administrative order. The system has not vanished. It has become archival. That word matters. Archive sounds secure, but it is one of the loneliest forms of continuity. An archive preserves against forgetting, but it cannot guarantee understanding. It can save names, dates, procedures, myths, and formulas, yet still fail to restore the original world in which those things were self-evident. Ancient Mesopotamia may have become, in part, a civilization archiving its own sacred beginnings while still living inside their after effects. The scribes copied the tablets, the priests enacted the rites, the kings claimed divine sanction. But under the surface the question remained unresolved. Were they extending a living order or administering its memory? There is no definitive tablet that confesses such uncertainty. Ancient cultures rarely write their deepest insecurity in plain terms. They reveal it indirectly, in excessive precision, in the reverence for antiquity, in the multiplication of interpretive specialists, in the persistence of forms whose original force seems increasingly difficult to recover. This is why the scribble world feels so poignant when read against the larger mystery. It is the scene of heroic fidelity under diminishing conditions, human beings refusing to let the oldest knowledge die, even as the conditions that first illuminated it are growing remote, and perhaps that fidelity delayed a greater forgetting. Without those schools, those lists, those ritual experts, the names of the Anunnaki might have dissolved entirely into the dust of collapsed cities. Instead, they endured. But in endurance they changed. They became more textual, more formal, more dependent on institutional memory. The old nearness thinned into procedure. From there, another transformation was bound to follow. Once sacred language is preserved more carefully than sacred immediacy, theology itself begins to change. The gods do not need to disappear from culture in order to become more distant. It is enough that they stop speaking plainly. It is enough that their names remain while their presence retreats behind symbol, doctrine, and increasingly abstract order. And when that happens, a civilization can continue to worship, while no longer quite inhabiting the same world its ancestors believed they had touched. If the priests and scribes stood at the edge of a vanished language, then the next stage would inherit something even more difficult, a cosmos still filled with divine names, but increasingly emptied of direct nearness, as though the gods had not died at all, only stepped farther back into the architecture, leaving humanity to speak ever more beautifully into the growing distance. Distance does not always arrive as disappearance. Sometimes it enters the world more gently, clothed in reverence, hidden inside refinement, disguised as maturity. A god once imagined as dangerously near may, over centuries, become more exalted, more abstract, more perfect, and in that perfection less accessible. Human beings often call this spiritual development. They say religion has deepened, that the divine has been purified of crude anthropomorphism, lifted beyond local hilltops and temple chambers into a more universal and transcendent form. Perhaps that is true. But another possibility lingers beneath the surface of the ancient world, quieter and more unsettling. Perhaps transcendence sometimes grows in the very place where presence has begun to fail. In the earliest Mesopotamian atmosphere, the divine was entangled with immediate structures. Gods founded cities, assigned kingship, controlled flood, storm, fertility, decree, and judgment. Their spheres were distributed, their responsibilities named, their ritual needs carefully met. The sacred order was high above human life, but also threaded through it. Heaven was not remote in the philosophical sense, it was hierarchically near. One could not see it directly, but one lived inside its administration. Later religious imagination, in Mesopotamia and beyond, often preserves the names while changing the emotional temperature. The gods remain immensely important, but they become grander, less immediate, more interpretive. Divine power is no longer encountered mainly as shared civic maintenance, but as cosmic sovereignty, as mystery, as moral or metaphysical order whose workings are less tangible and more difficult to predict. This development is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in differing forms across many civilizations. Yet within the Anunnaki question, it takes on a sharper edge, because if those beings once belonged to a memory of closeness, of divine administration at the threshold of human life, then their increasing remoteness may not be merely theological sophistication, it may be the emotional afterlife of withdrawal. This possibility does not accuse ancient believers of inventing abstraction to cover loss. The process is subtler than that. Cultures rarely say, "We can no longer find the gods, so we will elevate them into untouchable transcendence." They do something more human. They continue to revere what has become harder to approach. They preserve names, rituals, and hierarchies, while quietly accepting that the mode of relationship has changed. Over generations, distance acquires dignity. Silence becomes majesty. Uncertainty becomes mystery. What was once painful becomes sacred. One can feel this in the slow transformation of divine speech. In earlier sacred worlds, gods issue commands, appear in dreams, intervene in city life, demand offerings, strike enemies, confer authority. In later theological texture, they still do these things, but often through thicker layers of mediation. Priests interpret. Omens must be decoded. Texts must be consulted. Rituals must be performed with increasing precision. The divine is still active, yet no longer plain. It is as though humanity has moved from conversation into commentary, and commentary, however beautiful, is already one step removed from encounter. The Anunnaki themselves are part of this ambiguity. In some contexts, they remain a collective of powerful deities associated with decree, judgment, and the ordering of cosmic structures. In others, their meaning narrows or shifts, sometimes more strongly tied to the underworld, sometimes absorbed into broader divine hierarchies whose original atmosphere has already changed. Such movement is normal in religious history. Gods evolve, pantheons reorganize, titles migrate. Yet when these shifts are read alongside flood rupture, ecological strain, dangerous skies, and the increasing dependence on institutional memory, they begin to resemble not random evolution, but adaptation to absence. A culture keeps the forms, but must slowly relearn what the forms can still mean in a less responsive world. There is something almost tender in this adaptation. Humans do not surrender their oldest powers easily. They ennoble them. They lift them upward, beyond corruption and contingency, even while losing the simpler confidence that those powers still walk near the ground. A god who no longer answers predictably may become more morally absolute. A divine order no longer directly felt may become more philosophically refined. What cannot be reached can still be adored. In fact, distance often intensifies devotion. The hidden can inspire a deeper obedience than the visible ever did. But hiddenness also breeds a particular sorrow, because once the gods stop speaking plainly, human authority grows more unstable. Kings still claim sanction, yet they must defend it more anxiously. Priests still preserve rituals, yet they stand between the people and a silence they cannot entirely dispel. The temple still rises, but now as a site of mediation rather than obvious nearness. The same civilization that once described kingship descending from heaven begins to look increasingly like a civilization managing legitimacy after the original descent has grown remote. This is one reason later interpretations of the sacred often become more universal and more severe at the same time. If direct contact has weakened, then doctrine must strengthen. If divine presence has become elusive, then sacred order must be articulated more carefully, more insistently, sometimes more exclusively. Abstraction is not only philosophical elegance, it can also be a defense against fracture. It protects continuity by giving distance a conceptual home. In the broader history of religion, this movement would continue in profound ways. The divine becomes more singular, more transcendent, less locally embodied. Sacred law and ethical universality rise in significance. The gods of place yield in many traditions to God or gods beyond place. Of course, these developments have many causes: political, intellectual, social, theological. No single explanation can contain them. Yet beneath all those causes lies a haunting possibility that some portion of religious history is the long adaptation of human consciousness to a sacred nearness it once believed, however dimly, had been lost. If so, then the Anunnaki matter not because they prove any literal modern theory, but because they stand near the threshold where that adaptation may still be visible. They belong to an older register, one in which divine administration feels local, structural, almost civic. Their gradual recession into symbol, hierarchy, or distant theological memory suggests a civilization learning how to endure after the old intimacy has thinned. The names remain, the awe remains, but the mode of presence changes. Heaven is still there, perhaps more magnificent than ever. It is simply farther away, and human beings, being human, build beauty around that distance. They compose hymns more elaborate than before. They perfect ritual forms. They preserve archaic languages. They erect grander doctrines. They create cosmologies capable of holding silence without admitting that silence has entered. In this sense, theology can be understood not only as explanation, but as shelter. A shelter built against the coldness that follows when the world no longer feels as inhabited as it once did. Yet even the finest shelter cannot entirely erase the draught. Something of that chill lingers in the ancient record. It is present in the endless effort to interpret signs, in the reverence for remote antiquity, in the formalization of sacred authority, in the way divine power grows more sublime as it becomes less immediate. None of this proves that the gods left in any literal sense. It proves something more historically recognizable and perhaps more moving. Civilizations can feel the loss of nearness and spend centuries transforming that loss into culture. That transformation has consequences. Once divine presence becomes sufficiently abstract, it is more vulnerable to appropriation by political power. A god who no longer stands plainly within one city's living memory can be reorganized, elevated, merged, subordinated, or reinterpreted by empires eager to inherit the sacred without inheriting its original limits. Distance makes theology portable. It also makes it governable, and so another stage of the mystery approaches. If the old gods had already retreated into increasingly mediated forms, then the empires that followed would not merely inherit their names. They would inherit the right to reshape heaven itself, arranging the past, selecting which memories to preserve, which to polish, and which to bury beneath official order. If the gods had stopped speaking plainly, then who, in the centuries that followed, began speaking for them with the greatest confidence? Empires do not merely conquer land, they conquer sequence. They decide what came before, what still matters, what may be absorbed, and what must be renamed before it can be safely remembered. A city can fall in a season, but the deeper conquest begins later, when its gods are catalogued, its rituals adjusted, its sacred past rearranged to serve a larger order. This is one of the quiet violences of history. It rarely looks like destruction from the outside. It looks like preservation. Archives are gathered, temples are restored, old names are copied into new inscriptions. Yet beneath that surface of continuity, something profound is taking place. Heaven itself is being reorganized, and once heaven can be reorganized, memory is no longer free. Mesopotamia knew this process well. Sumer did not vanish neatly into silence. It was inherited, translated, appropriated, and politically repurposed by Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and later powers, each of which needed the authority of deep antiquity even as it reshaped that antiquity to fit present ambitions. This is not unusual. All civilizations inherit through transformation. But in Mesopotamia the process feels especially revealing because the sacred order had always been entwined with sovereignty. To control the past was not only to control narrative, it was to control legitimacy, kingship, and access to the architecture of divine sanction itself. This is why the Babylonian elevation of Marduk matters so much. In earlier Sumerian and Akkadian worlds, divine authority was distributed across a wider and older pantheon, with figures such as Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and others occupying deeply rooted roles. Yet as Babylon rose, Marduk's status expanded dramatically. In the Enuma Elish, he is elevated above other gods, defeating chaos, organizing the cosmos, and receiving the names and powers that mark supreme sovereignty. The text is magnificent, but it is also political theology. It is cosmology shaped by empire. The rise of Babylon required more than military success. It required a heaven proportionate to Babylonian power, and so the divine order was edited upward. This does not mean the old gods were erased outright. It is subtler than that. They were absorbed, subordinated, reinterpreted, redistributed. Their functions could be gathered into new hierarchies. Their ancient prestige could be retained while their relative independence diminished. A similar dynamic would appear again and again across the ancient world. Empires prefer continuity in appearance and centralization in effect. They preserve the shell of inheritance while altering the current flowing through it. If one looks at this process only politically, it seems familiar enough. Strong states consolidate religion in order to consolidate rule. But read against the longer question of the Anunnaki and divine withdrawal, the matter acquires another layer. What happens when empires inherit a sacred world that may already be operating under conditions of distance, attenuation, and fading immediacy? They do not merely preserve it, they stabilize it into official form. They convert uncertain memory into doctrine, fluid inheritance into controlled hierarchy. In other words, they do not just take over heaven, they simplify its ambiguities, and ambiguities are often where the oldest truths hide. The Anunnaki are a striking example of this. Their place in the earliest materials is complex, shifting, not entirely reducible to a single later definition. They hover between the high divine order, decrees of fate, ancestral antiquity, and in some later traditions, more underworld-associated roles. Such ambiguity is difficult for an empire. Administrative systems prefer sharper boundaries. A state-sponsored cosmology must know who rules, who answers to whom, and how authority is distributed. Thus, older sacred complexities become more manageable when reorganized beneath imperial theology. Assyria too offers a powerful case. There the national god Ashur increasingly mirrored the expansionist logic of the state itself. imperial warfare became fused with sacred mission. The king did not merely command armies, he acted as the chosen instrument of divine world order. This is a very particular transformation of religion. It does not eliminate older Mesopotamian inheritances, but it repurposes them. Heaven becomes strategic. The sacred is drafted into administration on a civilizational scale. Under such conditions, the old stories of divine nearness, flood rupture, and fading contact become dangerous if left uncontrolled. They must either be integrated into the imperial frame or softened into acceptable antiquity. The great libraries and archives of Mesopotamia complicate this picture in a beautiful and unsettling way. On the one hand, kings such as Ashurbanipal preserved enormous bodies of older knowledge, myths, omens, medical texts, rituals, lexical lists and epics, without which much would have been lost forever. This was an act of astonishing cultural conservation. On the other hand, conservation under empire is never innocent. To collect is also to curate. To preserve is also to choose arrangement. A library safeguards texts, but it also places them inside a political order that determines how they are accessed, copied and interpreted. This is the paradox of imperial memory. It rescues and domesticates at the same time. One begins to sense, then, how easy it would be for the oldest layers of sacred ambiguity to survive only in partial and controlled ways. Not through conspiracy in the modern melodramatic sense, but through a more ordinary and powerful mechanism. Empire rewards the versions of the past that support its structure. A god too local must be universalized or subordinated. A myth too disruptive must be reframed. A memory too strange must be ritualized until it ceases to threaten the present order. What cannot be disproved can still be managed. And perhaps this is how the deepest memory of withdrawal became harder to reach. Not lost in a single act of erasure, but gradually overlaid by official heavens built for empires that needed certainty more than they needed wonder. The old fracture remains underneath, but the surface becomes increasingly polished. The gods are still there, the temples still function, the sacred language still circulates, yet the world has become more narratively controlled. What was once remembered as broken contact is now housed inside cosmologies of empire, where divine order appears stable because instability would undermine the state. There is a melancholy in this. Human beings often imagine censorship as fire and destruction, but one of its most effective forms is reverent incorporation. A tradition is praised, archived, and absorbed so thoroughly that its sharper edges disappear. It remains present, but tamed. Its mysteries become literature. Its ruptures become symbols. Its unresolved questions are folded into the prestige of civilization itself. The later history of religion would repeat this pattern in different forms. Priestly systems, imperial courts, theological schools, and eventually scriptural orthodoxies would all inherit older sacred material and arrange it into survivable order. Some of this was necessary. Civilizations cannot live permanently inside ambiguity. They require norms, hierarchies, and official meanings, yet something is always sacrificed in the process. The unstable, haunting, partially remembered layers of origin are covered over, not because they were false, but because they were too disruptive to leave exposed. The Anunnaki, viewed from this angle, begin to resemble one of those buried layers, not a secret in the sensational sense, but a pressure beneath the polished floor of official history. Their names survive, yet increasingly within systems designed by later powers. Their role is remembered, yet through the filters of empire, translation, and theological consolidation. And every filter protects something while concealing something. So when one asks why the Anunnaki seem to leave the center of human memory, the answer may not lie only in flood, sky terror, or environmental collapse. It may also lie in what came after. Empires strong enough to inherit the sacred ruins of earlier ages and reorganize them into forms more useful to rule. The gods need not vanish for their silence to be rewritten. It is enough that later authorities speak over the gaps with confidence, and confidence once enthroned is difficult to challenge. A king restores a temple, claims the old gods, commissions copies of ancient texts, and presents himself as guardian of order. To his subjects it may look like continuity. To history it may indeed be continuity. But to the deeper wound beneath the tradition, it is also something else. The moment when humanity begins to live inside sacred systems increasingly curated by power. Systems that preserve the names of the past while narrowing the ways those names may still be understood. By then, the departure, if departure is the right word, has become almost impossible to see directly. Too many layers of reverent administration stand between the first fracture and the later record. Yet the very need for imperial heaven suggests that something older had become unstable enough to require management. And if empire could reorganize the gods of Mesopotamia, then perhaps the old memory did not die there at all. Perhaps it travelled, disguised and transformed into neighbouring civilizations, carrying with it the same quiet pattern of descent, catastrophe, withdrawal, and sacred kingship, as though many cultures were remembering different fragments of one larger silence. Some memories do not remain in one place. They migrate the way rivers migrate, abandoning one bed for another while still carrying the same water in altered channels. By the time a sacred pattern has crossed languages, mountains, dynasties, and centuries, it no longer looks identical to its first form. Names change, symbols are repainted, the old architecture of meaning is broken apart and built again with local stone, yet something inside it remains recognizable, a recurring arrangement of descent from heaven, a civilizing presence, a catastrophe, a withdrawal, a world afterward, forced to live by ritual and recollection, rather than direct nearness. It is this recurrence, scattered across neighbouring civilizations, that gives the old Mesopotamian wound its wider and more troubling horizon. One must be careful here. Comparative mythology can become reckless when it mistakes resemblance for proof. Similar stories do not automatically point to one historical origin. Floods are common. Sacred kingship is common. Divine beings descending to teach or rule are common. Human beings everywhere look upward, suffer catastrophe, and weave meaning through narrative. That caution matters, and yet caution should not harden into blindness. There are times when the persistence of certain structural motifs, especially across regions connected by trade, migration, conquest, and scribal exchange, deserves more than dismissal. It deserves listening. Egypt offers one of the first great echoes. Its sacred order differs profoundly from Mesopotamia in mood and metaphysics, yet some of the same emotional mechanics are there. Kingship descends from a divine realm. The pharaoh is not merely authorized by the gods, he stands within cosmic maintenance itself, responsible for preserving Mayat, the order that keeps the world from sliding back into chaos. The Nile, like the Mesopotamian rivers, sustains and threatens at once. Temple ritual is exacting. Sacred speech is precise. Antiquity carries immense authority. And beneath the polished confidence of Egyptian permanence, there also lies a recurring anxiety that order is fragile, that it must be continually renewed against the encroachment of disorder, flood failure, foreign invasion, and cosmic imbalance. The gods are near, but their nearness requires administration. This is not the same as the Anunnaki tradition, but it rhymes with it. The Levant preserves another set of resonances. In Ugaritic texts, divine councils gather. High gods preside while younger, more active powers contend over kingship, storm, and the right ordering of the world. The language of heavenly assembly, territorial divine authority, and the instability of sacred order feels strikingly familiar to anyone who has lingered in Mesopotamia. Later Hebrew literature, although fiercely reshaped by theological distinctiveness, still retains deep traces of this older Near Eastern atmosphere. The sons of God, the divine council imagery in certain psalms, the flood narrative, the descent of judgment from heaven, the dangerous nearness of divine presence at mountain or sanctuary, all suggest a world in which later monotheistic clarity was built over older strata of distributed sacred order. This does not flatten the differences. It only reveals continuity beneath contrast. Even Anatolia and the wider Eastern Mediterranean preserve versions of the same deeper drama. Hittite and Hurrian myth cycles carry themes of divine succession, heavenly conflict, storm god sovereignty, and the transfer or contest of cosmic rule. Greek myth, much later and reshaped through its own imaginative genius, still bears distant resemblances. Older powers displaced by younger ones, flood episodes, civilizing gifts from above, the instability of golden ages, and the sense that humanity lives in diminished relation to an earlier and more intimate divine era. None of this proves direct linear inheritance in every case, but it suggests that ancient civilizations repeatedly inhabited one large emotional landscape. The belief that the earliest age was closer to sacred force, and that history since then has unfolded under some form of decline, estrangement, or damaged inheritance. Once that pattern is seen, the question changes. It is no longer only whether the Mesopotamians remembered the Anunnaki in a uniquely local way. It becomes whether much of the ancient world was carrying related memories of sacred rupture, each civilization translating the break into its own symbols. One people speaks of flood, another of cosmic battle, another of a lost age of order, another of gods who once walked openly and later withdrew behind temples, mountains, or law. The language differs, but the movement is the same: nearness, catastrophe, distance. There is a reason such patterns are difficult to erase. They answer something fundamental in human consciousness. They explain why the world feels inherited yet damaged, ordered yet unstable, full of sacred architecture yet haunted by absence. They justify ritual, kingship, priesthood, memory, law. Above all, they preserve the suspicion that the present is not the original condition of things. We're living after something. That phrase may be the quiet center of the whole mystery. In Mesopotamia, after often means after the flood, after the descent of kingship, after the age of the impossible reigns. In Egypt, it can mean after the first ordering of chaos, after the reign of divine ancestors, after primordial time. In Greek thought, it becomes after the age of Cronus, after the golden race, after the closer commerce between gods and mortals. In later religious frameworks, it becomes after Eden, after revelation, after covenant broken and partially restored. The specific forms vary, but the intuition persists. History begins not at the beginning, but after a loss. That intuition may be the closest thing ancient civilizations offer to a shared testimony. One could argue, reasonably, that this is only psychology, that human beings naturally imagine better origins and sacred declines. But psychology does not exclude memory. Sometimes it is the vessel of memory. A trauma so ancient that it cannot be dated may survive not as factual clarity, but as recurring structure. The farther back the rupture lies, the more likely it is to endure in symbols rather than chronicles. In this sense, comparative mythology does not necessarily reveal literal common events. It reveals common pressures on memory, and sometimes those pressures may point to real episodes of environmental, social, or spiritual discontinuity too old to preserve in plain historical form. For the Anunnaki question, this matters immensely. If the old Mesopotamian material were entirely isolated, one might be tempted to treat it as a regional curiosity. But when neighbouring civilizations preserve their own variations on divine councils, sacred kingship, cataclysm and withdrawal, the possibility expands. Perhaps the Anunnaki are one local articulation of a wider ancient experience, the remembrance of powers once imagined as closer to the management of the world, followed by catastrophe and the long labour of adaptation. That labour leaves its mark everywhere, It creates temple cultures that preserve forms with exacting care. It creates priesthoods who guard inherited words more faithfully than they can fully explain. It creates kings who claim to mediate a heaven whose directness has already thinned. It creates myths that sound, beneath their beauty, like broken reports from the far side of a civilizational wound. And because each culture translates the wound differently, modern readers inherit not one coherent record, but a constellation of partial testimonies, fragments that resist unification and yet refuse to stop resembling one another. There is something almost unbearable in that. Not because it proves a lost global civilization or a single master narrative of divine departure. It does not. The evidence remains too varied, too damaged, too entangled with symbol. But it does suggest that ancient humanity may have shared a deeper unease than modern categories easily admit. The world was not simply founded, it was founded again. Order was not simply given, it was restored after interruption. The gods were not simply worshipped, they were remembered through increasing distance. And once one begins to see the ancient world in this light, another possibility emerges. Perhaps the catastrophe was not only external. Flood, drought, sky terror, imperial rewriting. Perhaps some part of the break occurred inside humanity itself. Perhaps after the age of rupture, people no longer perceived, recorded, or sustained the sacred in the same way. What vanished may not have been only the gods, but the human capacity to stand within their nearness without mediation. If so, then the deepest disaster was not the collapse of cities, but a change in consciousness itself, an inheritance so damaged that every civilization afterward had to build temples, myths, and empires just to remember what it could no longer directly receive. The most difficult catastrophes to recognize are the ones that do not remain outside the body. A city can measure its broken walls. A priest can count the tablets lost to fire. A kingdom can mark the year the river failed or the year invaders crossed the frontier. But when a rupture enters consciousness itself, when it changes how a people remember, perceive, symbolize, or endure, its damage becomes strangely difficult to describe. It leaves no single crater. It survives instead as atmosphere, a deepening dependence on ritual, a growing reverence for origins, a restless multiplication of symbols around something no longer directly accessible. And if the story of the Anunnaki carries the memory of departure, then perhaps the final threshold of that departure was not crossed only in the sky or on the earth. Perhaps it was crossed within humanity. This possibility has to be approached carefully, because the language available to ancient cultures was not the language of modern psychology, cognitive science, or trauma theory. They did not speak of collective memory in the terms later scholarship would use, and yet they lived through the thing itself. They knew what it meant for lineages to be interrupted, for cities to be rebuilt over prior cities, for sacred language to outlive comprehension, for stories to survive in fragments whose emotional force remained sharper than their explanatory clarity. In such a world, continuity was never guaranteed. It had to be manufactured through ritual, kingship, and transmission. That alone suggests that memory had become labour. Modern studies of trauma often note that overwhelming events do not always preserve themselves as orderly narrative. They return as fragments, bodily states, repeated images, displaced symbolism, ritualized behavior, and compulsive efforts to restore control. This insight belongs to modern vocabulary, but not only to modern experience. Ancient civilizations knew rupture intimately. They may not have theorized it clinically, but they encoded it culturally. A flood becomes the dividing line of time. A vanished age is granted impossible reign lengths. A ritual must be performed exactly or disaster may follow. A dead language is preserved because authority clings to it. These may be religious facts, political facts, literary facts, and also signs of a civilization surviving after shocks too large to metabolize cleanly. If that is true, then the question of divine withdrawal becomes more complicated and more human. The Anunnaki need not have vanished in some literal cinematic sense. It may be enough that human beings after the rupture no longer possess the same interior conditions required to experience sacred nearness in the old way. The relationship changes, not only because the gods recede, but because perception itself is damaged, narrowed, burdened with fear, mediation, and inherited discontinuity. What had once been immediate becomes unbearable, ambiguous, or inaccessible. There are precedents for this pattern across religious history. Sacred presence often becomes more difficult after crisis. Revelation is relocated to the past. Memory becomes holier than encounter. Institutions rise to stabilize what individuals can no longer trust themselves to hold directly. This does not mean the sacred disappears. It means contact is rerouted. The further a culture moves from foundational rupture, the more it tends to live from preserved traces rather than open immediacy. That is not decline in a simple sense. It is adaptation. Yet adaptation can feel, from within, like exile. One begins to see this in the architecture of ancient civilization itself. Why are beginnings so revered? Why is antiquity repeatedly treated not merely as old, but as normatively closer to truth? Why do kings, priests, and scribes all ground their authority in restoration rather than innovation? Why are temples maintained with such repetitive care, as though forgetting is always only one neglected rite away? A civilization confident in uninterrupted access to the sacred does not have to labour this hard to remain aligned. Such labour implies fragility, and fragility implies that the break was not only historical, but cognitive. Humanity did not merely lose facts, it lost a mode. That loss may also explain the peculiar shape of myth. Myths are often misread as failed science or decorative fiction, when in fact they may be what consciousness produces when direct continuity has already been severed. They preserve pattern without requiring complete explanation. They allow a culture to carry truths too large, too painful, or too obscured to remain in ordinary discourse. In that sense, the stories of the Anunnaki, of flood, of heavenly descent, of shortened reigns, and of sacred withdrawal may reflect not primitive confusion, but damaged fidelity. The memory is real enough to demand form, yet too fractured to survive as plain report. And what fractures consciousness more effectively than repeated catastrophe? Not only one flood, one drought, or one political collapse, but centuries of layered instability, ecological stress, celestial dread, imperial conquest, language shift, temple loss, forced migration, social hierarchy, and the constant awareness that order can vanish faster than the stories used to justify it. Under such conditions, human beings do not remain psychologically transparent to themselves. They become historical. By that is meant something more than living in time. They begin to inherit wounds they did not witness directly. They preserve rituals whose original necessity they no longer fully understand. They become the caretakers of interrupted meanings. This may be the hidden sadness inside the priesthood and scribal traditions. They are often described correctly as institutions of knowledge, but they are also institutions of compensation. They preserve what ordinary memory can no longer safely hold. They externalize continuity into tablets, calendars, chants, and built space. Civilization itself becomes a prosthetic memory for a species that suspects it has forgotten something essential. The temple remembers in stone, the tablet remembers in clay, the ritual remembers in gesture, the myth remembers in image. Together they form a great architecture around an absence that can be approached but not fully restored. If the Anunnaki belong to that absence, then their departure may have been experienced in part as a decline in human receptivity. Perhaps the world after catastrophe was noisier, more fearful, more stratified, more dependent on institutional mediation. Perhaps humanity became less capable of inhabiting the old threshold where heaven and earth once seemed continuous, not because intelligence diminished but because consciousness reorganized around survival. Trauma narrows attention. It prioritizes repetition, vigilance, control. Those are exactly the tendencies one sees intensifying in civilizations that live beneath the shadow of rupture. And once vigilance becomes normal, mystery changes character. It is no longer a doorway, it becomes a managed danger. This may be why later sacred systems feel both more elaborate and less intimate. Their symbols are richer, their doctrines more developed, their rites more exact, and yet the emotional temperature is different from the earliest atmosphere of descent and installation. Nearness has become something to regulate, interpret, and defend against misuse. The divine is still there, perhaps even more powerful in conceptual scope, but humanity approaches through layers. The raw threshold has been veiled. In that sense, history itself becomes a safety mechanism. It keeps later cultures from standing too directly inside what earlier ones may have encountered with less protection. There is no way to prove such a transformation in any final sense. The evidence is indirect, scattered across texts, rituals, and recurring structures of memory. But the indirectness may be part of the point. A damaged consciousness would not leave a neat confession. It would leave exactly what the ancient world leaves: reverence for origins, obsessive preservation, recurring catastrophe myths, and an ache of distance that grows stronger the closer one moves toward the beginning. Perhaps that is why every attempt to reconstruct the first sacred age feels incomplete. The missing evidence is not only archaeological, the missing capacity may be human. We search for lost tablets, lost cities, lost chronologies, and perhaps all of that matters. But what if something more intimate was also buried? A way of perceiving order before the long discipline of trauma transformed perception into defense. Then the greatest disaster in the Anunnaki story was not simply that divine beings left, or that the world was reset, or that empires rewrote memory. It was that humanity learned to survive the absence so thoroughly that survival itself began to look like normality. The rituals remained, the kingdoms rose, the myths endured, the heavens were studied, the fields were planted. Civilization continued. Yet beneath that continuity lingered a quieter possibility, that the human world after the break was never quite the same instrument it had once been. And if humanity itself became altered, less able to receive, more dependent on symbols, more likely to mistake preservation for presence, then the search for why the Anunnaki disappeared leads toward a final and unsettling mirror. The silence may not belong only to the gods. Some of it may belong to the mind that now listens, straining toward an older frequency it no longer knows how to hear. If that is true, then the lost world is not buried only beneath ruins or sealed in tablets. It is buried somewhere in the architecture of human remembering itself, waiting behind all the forms built to protect us from realizing how much was forgotten. The earth is generous with concealment. It buries what it cannot preserve in plain sight, folds whole centuries beneath wind-blown dust, lets moisture soften brick into soil until cities become low hills and memory begins to look like geology. Yet concealment is only half the tragedy. The other half is fragmentation. What survives of the ancient world rarely survives whole. A broken tablet here, a scorched archive there, a royal inscription with lines missing, a library shattered by war, then covered by the debris of a later occupation. Human beings speak easily of the record, as though the past had the decency to remain intact. But the deeper one enters Mesopotamia and its neighbouring civilizations, the more one discovers that history stands on absences almost as much as evidence. And when the subject is something as elusive as the fading of the Anunnaki from the centre of human memory, absence is not a side note. It is part of the story itself. Ancient Mesopotamia was in one sense astonishingly fortunate. Clay, unlike papyrus or parchment, can survive in ruined conditions that would erase almost everything else. Fire, which destroys so much, can sometimes harden tablets and preserve them. Because of this accident of material culture, thousands upon thousands of cuneiform texts endured. administrative accounts, lexical lists, hymns, omens, treaties, myths, astronomical records, royal boasts, prayers, and ritual instructions all drifted forward through collapse, conquest, and abandonment. Without clay, the ancient Near East would be far more silent than it already is, and still it is unbearably incomplete. What has been found is only a fraction of what once existed. Many tablets were broken beyond reconstruction. Many libraries vanished without trace. Countless texts remain unread, disputed, dispersed in museums, or preserved only in partial copies made centuries after their original composition. Archaeology itself is uneven. Some sites were excavated recklessly in earlier eras. Some remain inaccessible because of conflict, politics, or the simple cost of sustained fieldwork. Some were looted. Some are still waiting under the ground. Every confident sentence written about deep antiquity therefore rests, whether it admits it or not, on an architecture of missing things. This matters profoundly. Because where evidence is fragmentary, later systems of interpretation grow powerful. Scholars must reconstruct. Priests once reconstructed. Empires reconstructed. Translators reconstruct. Every age, encountering incomplete remains, arranges them into intelligible sequence. This is necessary and noble work. But it also means that the past arrives already filtered through methods, assumptions, and inherited frameworks. No one reads the ancient world from nowhere. One reads through damage. Mesopotamian chronology itself carries this tension. Dynastic sequences are rebuilt from king lists, economic tablets, royal inscriptions, synchronisms, astronomical references, and later copies of earlier records. Often the work is brilliant. Sometimes it is uncertain. Gaps remain. Entire periods are debated. Dates shift by decades or more depending on chronological model. This does not mean history is arbitrary. It means precision diminishes as one approaches the oldest strata. And once precision weakens, the emotional power of narratives about beginnings, floods, divine order, and rupture grows harder to disentangle from the brokenness of the evidence preserving them. The libraries of the ancient world intensify this feeling. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh preserved a treasure house of Mesopotamian knowledge, including versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, omen series, rituals, and lexical works. It is one of the great salvations in intellectual history. Yet even this library is a reminder of loss. What survived there survived because an Assyrian king gathered and controlled texts for imperial purposes. The very archive that preserves ancient memory also reveals how dependent survival is on political circumstance. Elsewhere, libraries burned, temple storerooms collapsed, and local archives disappeared into earth that remembers nothing unless accident is merciful. Then, there are the lost centers no one can fully reconstruct. How many temple libraries existed in southern Mesopotamia whose tablets dissolved before excavation? How many local myths or ritual traditions vanished because they were never recopied into dominant scribal networks? How many earlier versions of later known texts once carried nuances now beyond recovery? We do not know. That phrase, "we do not know," belongs at the heart of all serious work on antiquity, yet it is precisely the phrase most later mythmakers, ideologues and polemicists prefer to avoid, and so the field is haunted from both sides. On one side lies academic caution, sometimes so careful that the emotional force of the surviving patterns is flattened into technical reserve. On the other side lies speculative certainty, eager to turn every gap into sensational proof. Between them stands a more difficult truth. The ancient world is genuinely incomplete, and incompleteness is not permission to invent, but neither is it permission to pretend the missing portions do not matter. They do matter. Sometimes the shape of what is lost can be felt by the pressure it exerts on what remains. This is especially true with the Anunnaki. Their names survive. Their functions appear across important texts. Their role in the older cosmological order is undeniable. Yet the coherence modern readers often want, a single definitive doctrine, a final explanation of origin, presence and departure, is not available. Perhaps it never existed in that form, or perhaps it did, in temple archives long since reduced to dust. The point is not to smuggle fantasy into the silence. The point is to notice how much of the silence has material causes. When a civilization's memory is transmitted through fragmentary clay, burnt cities, rewritten copies, and broken dynasties, even a real pattern of withdrawal could survive only in partial forms. Translation introduces another layer of fragility. Ancient languages do not yield themselves easily. Sumerian in particular has long posed formidable challenges, and although scholarship has advanced tremendously, meanings can remain uncertain, context-dependent, or contested. A single sign may carry different values. A damaged line may permit multiple restorations. Terms that later readers translate as gods, lords, judges, or decrees bring modern connotations into ancient semantic fields that were never identical to ours. This is not failure, it is the condition of serious reading. But it means the past reaches us through a veil of approximations, however disciplined those approximations may be. One begins to see, then, how easily later certainty could be built on ancient uncertainty. A historian arranges fragments responsibly. A theologian later hardens them into doctrine. A popular writer extracts one motif and inflates it. A skeptic dismisses the rest because the data are incomplete. Everyone is, in one way or another, speaking over ruins. Meanwhile, the ruins themselves say something humbler and more haunting. There was more here than survives. Archaeology of absence may sound like a contradiction, but in truth it is one of the oldest forms of listening. An erased layer, a disturbed stratum, a textual lacuna, a missing ending to a myth. These are not merely frustrations. They are signs that transmission has been interrupted, and interruption is central to the larger question. If the world of the Anunnaki was remembered through catastrophe, shrinking kingly spans, fading temple immediacy, and increasingly archival religion, then fragmentary preservation is not just a scholarly inconvenience. It mirrors the theme itself. The evidence comes to us damaged because the civilization that carried it had already experienced damage as one of its defining conditions. Perhaps that is why lost libraries and broken tablets exert such disproportionate fascination. They dramatize in material form what the myths already suggest in symbolic form. Something immense was severed, and what remains is only enough to prove that more once existed. Not enough to restore it, only enough to feel the contour of its absence. By this point in the story, one can almost sense the temptation to force a conclusion, to say the missing archives must once have contained the answer. To imagine a final tablet, a hidden chamber, a lost sequence of texts that would reveal why the Anunnaki withdrew and how catastrophe remade the world. But the older and more honest path refuses such comfort. History rarely gives back what it has swallowed. Sometimes the truest record is not revelation, but a symmetry, the disproportion between what once must have been known and what now can be said. And yet even that asymmetry teaches something. It teaches that the silence around the Anunnaki is not empty. It is structured by lost media, broken transmission, imperial curation, translation limits, and the accidents of survival. What looks like mythic haze may partly be the residue of real archival catastrophe. The missing explanation may not be missing because it never existed. It may be missing because whole chains of custody failed under flood, fire, conquest, neglect, and time, which leads toward the final threshold of the mystery. If the evidence is broken, the memory layered, the empire selective, and human consciousness itself altered by catastrophe, then the last question is no longer simply where the Anunnaki went. It is whether departure is even the right word. For all that has been said of flood, sky, earth, temple, priesthood, and loss, one possibility still stands waiting in the dark. Perhaps what later ages remembered as withdrawal was not exile, nor extinction, nor simple abandonment, but a boundary imposed after the rupture, something closer to quarantine, separation, or the closing of a door humanity was no longer permitted to cross. And if a door was closed, the silence after it shut may be exactly what history has spent millennia trying and failing to name. A door does not have to be visible to govern a civilization. It is enough that people begin to sense, however dimly, that there are thresholds no longer open to them, realms once approached through ritual, kingship, dream, or sacred architecture that now answer only through distance, omen, and memory. Human beings are remarkably adaptable to closure. They build doctrines around it. They rename it transcendence. They call it the mystery of the divine will, the hiddenness of heaven, the humility proper to mortal creatures. And perhaps all of those names are, in their own way, true. But there remains another possibility, one that gathers slowly out of flood traditions, shrinking ages, dangerous skies, failing earth, mediating temples, priestly preservation, imperial reorganization, and the long damage of human memory. Perhaps what later ages experienced as the withdrawal of the Anunnaki was not simply departure. Perhaps it was separation enforced after catastrophe, something closer to exile, quarantine, or the closing of access between incompatible worlds. It is a severe thought, and it must be held gently. There is no tablet that states it plainly. No Mesopotamian text announces, in terms a modern reader could mistake for certainty, that heaven sealed itself off because the old relation with humanity could not continue. The evidence remains indirect, yet indirect evidence has guided the whole journey. Presence without farewell, continuity after rupture, ritual intensifying as immediacy weakens, a world increasingly built around preservation rather than encounter. These patterns do not prove quarantine, but they make simple abandonment feel somehow insufficient. Departure suggests decision. It suggests that one side leaves, while the other remains structurally unchanged. Yet nothing in the ancient record feels structurally unchanged after the great breaks. The world itself narrows. Time compresses. Kingship becomes more human in scale. Divine order becomes more mediated. The environment grows less reliable. The heavens acquire menace. Memory becomes institutional labour. Everything behaves as though a threshold had not merely been crossed, but sealed behind those who survived it. In such a world, the old sacred closeness would not merely fade. It would become impossible to inhabit under the new conditions. This is where exile becomes a useful image, not because it can be proven as historical fact, but because it preserves the emotional texture of the aftermath. Exile is not simple loss. It is loss with memory of belonging. It carries the ache of knowing that one comes from somewhere one can no longer re-enter, either because one has changed, the place has changed, or a boundary now stands where none stood before. Much of ancient religious consciousness sounds like this. Humanity remembers origins more intensely than it remembers destinations. Sacred architecture faces a vanished nearness. Ritual repeats as though repetition itself were a form of homesickness. Yet exile alone may be too human a word for what the Anunnaki story hints at. Quarantine introduces a colder possibility. It suggests separation not for punishment alone, nor merely because of divine caprice, but because contact itself had become dangerous. Dangerous to whom is the difficult question? To humanity? To the divine order? To the stability of the world after catastrophe? One can imagine several possibilities, none final, all disturbing. Perhaps the flood and the wider chain of environmental and celestial disruptions rendered the old system impossible to maintain. The beings associated with the upper order, whether understood literally, symbolically, or somewhere between the two, could no longer remain entangled in earthly administration without worsening instability. In that case, withdrawal would resemble emergency containment. The bridge between worlds is not destroyed out of cruelty, but closed because the structure around it is failing. Or perhaps the danger lay in humanity itself. The Atrahasis tradition already carries the unsettling notion that human proliferation, noise, or unmanaged expansion had become intolerable to the divine order. Read narrowly, this is mythic anthropology. Read more broadly, it opens a darker line of thought. What if post-catastrophic humanity had become incompatible with the former mode of nearness? More numerous, more violent, more traumatically altered, more dependent on power structures that could not endure open contact with whatever the Anunnaki represented. Then separation would not be mere abandonment. It would be a response to a species no longer standing in the same moral, ecological, or perceptual relation to the sacred. There is another possibility still, even more difficult to phrase. Perhaps the departure was really the removal of the permission. Earlier ages may have operated within a kind of overlap. Heaven and earth not fused but proportioned closely enough that ritual, kingship, and consciousness could receive a more immediate sacred pressure. Catastrophe then breaks that proportion. Afterward, the overlap is reduced. Access remains possible only through symbol, preservation, and mediated forms because the raw threshold has become unstable. In this model, quarantine is not a wall built by one offended party against another. It is a structural consequence of cosmic misalignment. Such thoughts may sound abstract, yet ancient civilizations often narrated them concretely. Paradise lost, flood, tower broken, divine counsel withdrawn, oracle obscured, law replacing presence, temple replacing mountain, priest replacing encounter. These are not identical traditions, but they share an intuition that after some primal break, humanity continues under altered conditions. It is allowed to remember partially. It is allowed to preserve imperfectly, but it is not allowed, or not able, to stand in the old nearness as before. If so, the great sacred institutions of the ancient world begin to look different again. Temples are not merely houses of worship. They are regulated interfaces. Priests are not merely leaders of devotion. They are custodians of safe distance. Texts are not merely records. They are buffers, preserving the pattern in language where unmediated contact is no longer possible. Even empire, for all its distortions, may be understood in part as humanity's attempt to stabilize itself after access had closed. Power rushes in where presence withdraws, administration thickens where certainty thins, and this may explain why so many traditions retain a profound ambivalence toward knowledge. Wisdom is revered, yet dangerous. Names have power, yet must be handled carefully. Heavenly signs are sought, yet feared. Sacred law preserves order, but also limits approach. Human beings are repeatedly warned about crossing boundaries too directly. In a world shaped by quarantine, knowledge itself would carry the memory of closed thresholds. To know too much, too quickly, without the right preparation, would be to risk re-entering a zone no longer meant for ordinary human habitation. One could object that such language simply romanticizes the universal human experience of limitation. Perhaps. But the persistence of these patterns, across so many neighboring civilizations and so many layers of myth, ritual, and sacred history, suggests at least this much. Ancient humanity did not imagine its distance from the divine as normal in a trivial sense. It felt the distance as aftermath. Whether one calls the aftermath exile, quarantine, concealment, or theological maturation depends partly on one's framework. The emotional record, however, remains remarkably consistent. We are later than the first age. We are farther away than those who began the story. We live within preserved forms of something once closer, and so the question of why the Anunnaki left becomes inseparable from the question of what kind of world remained after they were no longer near. A closed door changes both sides. Those outside must reorganize their lives around absence. Those inside become, with time, indistinguishable from myth. The longer the separation lasts, the more likely later ages are to mistake regulated distance for metaphysical truth. They forget that something may once have been otherwise, yet forgetting is never complete. It survives as ache, as symbol, as ritual exactness, as the recurring fantasy of return. Ancient cities rebuilt their sanctuaries not only because they feared the gods, but because part of them still lived toward reunion. Even when theology grew abstract, even when empire curated memory, even when sacred language became archival, the old orientation remained. Humanity kept facing the closed threshold, speaking toward it, listening for movement beyond it. And perhaps that is the final severity of the mystery. If the Anunnaki did not merely vanish, but withdrew behind a boundary imposed after catastrophe, then history since that moment has unfolded in the shadow of a separation never fully accepted. Civilization itself may be, among other things, the art of living beside a sealed door, while continuing to build monuments in the hope that one day it might open again. But if there was a boundary, and if it was closed for reasons bound to catastrophe, incompatibility, or dangerous nearness, then one last question remains, more intimate than all the others. After so many centuries of adaptation, ritual, forgetting, and survival, would humanity even recognize the old threshold if it opened now? Or has the long life lived outside it changed us so deeply that we would mistake return for another kind of ruin? There are ruins that seem to belong to the past, and there are ruins that seem to belong to the human mind. The first can be measured. Their walls can be traced from the air, their bricks catalogued, their foundations dated, their inscriptions compared against dynasties and drought layers, and the slow migration of rivers. The second kind of ruin is hard to approach. It lives in the strange persistence of certain questions, in the way whole civilizations continue to build towards something they can no longer fully name, in the recurring human intuition that history did not begin in innocence, but in aftermath. By the time the last echoes of the Anunnaki fall silent in the official record, that second ruin is already complete. Humanity is still building temples, still copying texts, still reading the sky, still grounding authority in heaven, still speaking as if some order higher than itself remains near enough to matter. And yet, the atmosphere has changed. What once may have been encounter has become orientation. What may once have been presence has become memory disciplined into ritual. What may once have stood at the centre of the world now survives mostly as an ache around its edges. Perhaps this was always going to happen. Perhaps every sacred order, given enough centuries, withdraws into abstraction. Perhaps nearness is only the illusion of beginnings, and distance the true condition of mature civilizations. This is the explanation that comforts the modern mind, because it converts loss into development. It says nothing was taken, nothing failed. The gods simply became ideas, myth became literature, ritual became culture, and humanity grew up. There is elegance in that account, and perhaps a measure of truth, but it leaves something unresolved. It does not explain why the oldest stories carry the tone of fracture rather than gradual improvement. It does not explain why flood stands in the middle of time like a wound. It does not explain why sacred authority becomes more mediated as memory becomes more archival. It does not explain the unusual gravity with which so many ancient civilizations speak of having come after a break, after a first age, after a greater nearness no longer available to ordinary life. And so, the mystery remains. Not because one answer has been hidden in some dramatic vault waiting to be discovered, but because the evidence points in too many directions at once while continuing to whisper the same emotional truth. Something ended, or something changed so profoundly that later language could preserve only its outline. The Anunnaki in this longer reading are not important because they confirm a single theory. They matter because they stand inside the oldest surviving attempt to name a vanished order. They belong to the memory of a world where heaven was not merely believed in, but structured into the legal, agricultural, ritual, and political grammar of existence with a kind of administrative intimacy later ages increasingly struggle to maintain. This is why the question of their departure feels larger than the beings themselves. If they left because of catastrophe, then the human story begins in surviving a broken cosmos. If they withdrew because the Earth became unstable, then civilization is a long adaptation to diminished conditions. If they vanished because humanity became incompatible with sacred nearness, then progress may conceal a deeper estrangement. If empires rewrote the memory of their withdrawal, then official history rests upon managed silence. If the true disaster took place inside human consciousness, then the oldest loss is not only external, it is woven into perception itself. And if some form of boundary closed after the rupture, whether one calls it exile, quarantine, or the narrowing of reality, then civilization may be nothing less than the art of building meaning beside a sealed threshold. That possibility changes the moral atmosphere of history. It suggests that human greatness and human amnesia may have grown together. The same species that raised cities, charted stars, invented law, and preserved memory in clay may have done so because it no longer possessed the simpler confidence of belonging to a transparent sacred order. We built because we had lost. We recorded because we had forgotten. We ritualized because spontaneity no longer felt safe. We theologized because silence had entered the center of things and needed a noble name. Under that reading, civilization is not the opposite of abandonment. It is its most intricate response. And yet the story does not become bleak. There is, buried within all this loss, something unexpectedly gentle. Human beings did not surrender to the silence. They listened harder. They turned brick into mountains, language into vessels, music into invocation, law into alignment, story into a chamber where damaged memory could continue breathing. Even if the Anunnaki became distant, even if the old world closed, even if the first sacred age shattered under flood and dust and rewriting, humanity answered not only with fear, but with fidelity. It kept facing upward. It kept preserving names it no longer fully understood. It kept leaving room in the world for return. That may be why the image of the empty throne refuses to disappear. Across cultures, across ages, there remains some version of it. The absent king, the silent sanctuary, the god who once spoke openly and now answers only through signs, the gate guarded after the first trespass, the temple maintained for a presence that no longer arrives in the old way. These are not merely religious ornaments, they are memory forms. They suggest that, at some level deeper than doctrine, humanity has never entirely accepted the finality of separation. It behaves, again and again, like a species waiting. Waiting is not always passive. Sometimes it becomes architecture. Sometimes it becomes scholarship. Sometimes it becomes prayer. Sometimes it becomes the stubborn refusal to treat ancient myths as childish inventions when they continue to hold, beneath all distortion, the shape of real human bewilderment. There is dignity in that refusal. It does not demand certainty. It only asks that old stories be allowed their full gravity. The Mesopotamian scribes may not have known that millennia later strangers would still lean over their tablets, trying to understand why the divine order felt so near at the beginning and so difficult to find thereafter. Yet by preserving those fragments, they extended the question forward. They placed it in human custody, and now it belongs in some quiet way to every later age that senses its own estrangement. Perhaps that is where the story should remain, not sealed by conclusion, not flattened into doctrine, not turned into spectacle. The Anunnaki may have been gods, councils, celestial powers, ancestral authorities, or the names given to realities history can no longer approach directly. Their departure may have been literal only in the language available to myth, or myth may be the most literal language the wound ever had. Nothing in the surviving record allows the comfort of final certainty. But certainty was never the true gift hidden in the ruins. The gift was the question itself, and the way it returns humanity to a more difficult humility. Because if the first civilizations remembered a nearness that later ages could only preserve in ritual, then the modern world may not stand at the end of that process, but deep inside it. We too inherit fragments, systems, abstractions, official narratives, broken archives, and a sky we can measure more precisely than ever, while perhaps understanding less intimately than those who feared it. We too live among astonishing structures built to stabilize a species that senses, somewhere beneath all noise, that it has forgotten something foundational. We too speak in confident explanations while old absences continue to breathe beneath the floor of history. So the story closes where it began, not with an answer, but with a silence shaped like a missing presence. Somewhere in the oldest dust of Mesopotamia, beneath the cities raised for gods and kings, beneath flood silt and collapsed libraries and the weight of empires that learned to govern memory, there remains the outline of an older arrangement. One can almost feel it without seeing it clearly, like a pattern under worn fabric or a constellation hidden by daylight. It suggests that the human world was once imagined as nearer to its source than it is now, and that everything built since then, temple, archive, empire, theology, history, may be, in one way or another, an attempt to live with that distance. And when the last lamp in the temple goes dark and the final tablet cools in the earth and the wind moves softly over foundations no one remembers by name, the question does not disappear. It only becomes quieter. It waits there with the patient things, stone, night, ruined thresholds, the empty seat before the stars, as if history itself were still listening for footsteps that may never return, and warning, with all its broken tenderness, that the deepest losses are not always the ones humanity can prove, but the ones it keeps rebuilding its world around, as though somewhere in the dark it still knows they happened.